Majestic Owl Publishing, LLC presents The Diamond Hunt, Book 4, from the Rosemary Harbor Cozy Mystery Series. Written by Wendy Meadows and read for you by Michelle, from Google AI. Chapter 1. Spot sat on Hillary's shoulder, and he was quiet for a change. It was as if he understood Hillary's concentration and respected it. Hillary had been reading mysteries since Spot had joined the Sheridan household years ago, after all. Hillary put her finger between the pages and flipped to the end of the book. She couldn't stand the suspense, she had to know how it ended. Agatha Christie had written more than 100 books, and every single one of them was gripping until the very end. Hillary didn't know how the woman had done it. Each Agatha Christie book she read sucked Hillary in, and until she finished it, she could think about nothing else. "You're cheating the system," Spot squawked, and Hillary jumped. She sighed, returning to the page she had been reading. You're right, she said. "I can't believe you're policing how I read a book." Spot didn't answer, and it was just as well. If the bird wasn't going to let Hillary cheat and watch her read the ending before she reached it, he had best be quiet so she could get through the pages and finish the book. There were only a few pages left, but Hillary still didn't know who the killer was. Agatha Christie's books were Hillary's guilty pleasure. When she picked up one of her books, something she always vowed she wouldn't do again and always did, it drew her in and she forgot about the world around her. Hillary became so enthralled with the stories that she sacrificed sleep. She would often read while she was doing other things, like chores around the house or keeping an eye on the shop. "I don't know how she does it," Hillary said to Spot. "She plants a killer right under my nose, and I can never find him." Hillary loved a challenge. With a knack for deductive reasoning and the curiosity that encouraged her to use her talent, Hillary didn't miss much. If someone could outsmart her and trick her until the very end of a story, they deserved her respect. "The killer is someone you thought you knew," Spot said. Hillary chuckled. "That's not only clever, it's creepy." She ran her hands through her shoulder-length auburn hair. The bell above the shop door rang and she sighed. Duty called. Annabelle walked into something special. She was coming back from her lunch break and saw her mother leaning on the counter with her elbows. She was still engrossed in that book, right where Annabelle had left her an hour ago. Annabelle rolled her eyes. "You're obsessed, Mom. You're only saying that because you already read it and you know how it ends. It's driving me mad. I'm not as bad as you are. You always let these books suck you in." Hillary shrugged, turning her eyes back to the page. "I'm not even going to talk about your romance movies." Annabelle smiled and shook her head. Her mom was right. Annabelle got lost in romance movies, letting them consume her the same way Hillary let mysteries pull her in. It was purely about interest. Annabelle didn't understand why Hillary loved mysteries so much. She had read the book Hillary was reading now, but she hadn't been as absorbed by it. She guessed it was a matter of taste. "I can't stand this," Hillary said. "I hate how she always makes me wait until the very end. But I can't stay away from her books. I love the torture." Annabelle giggled. "You're such a cliché, Mom." "I love it." Hillary didn't respond. "It will all be explained in the end, you know that," Annabelle said. "Keep reading. I know you're going to have a moment where you're shocked, and then you're going to tell me you should have seen it coming." Hillary glanced at her daughter. "Am I that predictable?" "Yes, you are," Annabelle said with a chuckle and walked to the storage room where Rose was unpacking a box. Rose Humbert owned the building space that Annabelle and her mother rented for something special. She was the queen of retail, owning more than half of the shop buildings in Rosemary Harbor, but she worked for Hillary as a shop assistant because she was bored. At first, she had taken the job because she was curious about the newcomers, but over the past year and a half, Rose and Hillary had become close friends, and their relationship was no longer based on Rose looking for gossip fodder. "She's not going to put that book down until she finishes it," Annabelle said to Rose. The older woman chuckled. "I know. I've been handling customers all day because Hillary can't stop reading. It's endearing. It's irritating, Annabelle said. Your mom lets you binge eat ice cream while you watch your tearjerker movies, Rose pointed out. Annabelle pulled up her shoulders. Done, Hillary said, coming into the storage room a few minutes later, a grin on her face. I finally know how it ends. Gosh, what a journey. Annabelle and Rose exchanged amused glances. Hillary was in a good mood now that she had finished the book, and she jumped in to help unpack stock. I can't wait for the getaway, she gushed. Hillary was part of a book club that the older ladies around town had created. When she moved to the quaint coastal town of Rosemary Harbor, Hillary joined every group she could find to meet people. Since then, she had quit the gardening club because of drama, realized she could cook much better than anything the cooking classes at City Hall offered, and had a failed attempt at crocheting. But the book club had stuck. It had been a case of trial and error. Every month, the women in the book club got together to discuss the book they'd read that month and choose a new book. Once every quarter, they planned a getaway, a few days that were filled with reading and gossiping and relaxing. Hillary would be joining them for the first time on their upcoming trip. The Agatha Christie book she just finished was for the book club, and she couldn't wait to discuss it with the other ladies. I heard Janet had some renovations done to the farm, Rose said. Rose knew everything that had happened and would happen around town. She moved with her ear constantly to the ground, and she didn't hesitate to share what she heard. With everyone. Hillary nodded. I heard. I'm excited to see what she's done with the place. I think it's going to be great. Everyone is so nice. Rose raised her eyebrows at Hillary. What? Hillary asked. I want to know too, Annabelle said, watching the conversation unfold. Rose shook her head. I thought you could sniff out a mystery, Hillary. Those women are so dramatic. The stories that unfold are better than the mysteries you bury yourself in. Hillary frowned. Really? I've never seen them at each other. The women are all friends. We get together and discuss the books we read, the controversies and hidden meanings, reality versus fantasy, that kind of thing. We're good friends. Rose laughed. They know how to hide what's going on, don't they? She said. Annabelle and Hillary looked at each other. They had long ago learned to take many of Rose's questions as rhetorical. I think it's going to be great, Annabelle offered. If by great you mean dramatic, you're right, Rose said. Why do you keep saying that? Hillary asked. They're normal people. Like you and me. Rose laughed again. They're not like us at all. You only see them once a week for an hour and haven't been to any of the getaways. Trust me. You can't have two sets of sisters, well, one set of sisters and a sister and sister-in-law, and friends that know each other's scandals better than their own and expect everything to run smoothly. It can't be that bad, Hillary said. Spot squawked noisily. Watch your back, watch your back. Rose sighed. For once that bird is right. It won't be a bad idea to watch your back. Hillary shook her head. She wasn't going to let them talk her out of the getaway. Since she had arrived in Rosemary Harbor, she had worked almost non-stop getting her shop up and running, and she deserved a break. She was going away with the women from the book club. They would discuss the book, and it was going to be a wonderful time away. Still, Hillary couldn't help but feel uneasy about what Rose said. She would never have admitted to it, but Spot's creepy words and Rose's serious face made her feel like she was missing something. A cold finger slid down her spine, making her shiver. She shook it off. She was still caught up in the book, and Rose was being dramatic as always. Are you sure you will be all right without me? Hillary asked, looking around the shop. They were usually 3 women, working together. Of course, Mom, Annabelle said. This will hardly be the first time only 2 of us will be manning the shop. Hillary nodded. It was true. When Rose was arrested as a suspect in a crime she didn't commit, it had been down to Annabelle and Hillary to take care of things for days. But now that it was Hillary who would disappear for a while, it felt wrong. Hillary liked being in control, but she needed the break, and she had to learn to let go. "I think it would be better if I leave after closing time," Hillary said. "Just to be sure." Annabelle shook her head. "No, Mom. You can go home, pack your things, and go on your retreat. You deserve this." Annabelle looked at the clock as she said it, and Hillary got the distinct feeling Annabelle was trying to get rid of her. Why would her daughter be eager for Hillary to leave? She wanted to ask but decided against it. Annabelle was getting older and more independent, and if she wanted to meet someone, she didn't need Hillary's permission. Still, Hillary was curious. What was Annabelle up to? Hillary hoped, for her daughter's sake, she had plans for the weekend. Since they had moved to Rosemary Harbor from Miami, Annabelle had been slow to open up and make friends. She was heading on to 25, and she was still single, often spending time alone at home rather than going out. It was part of Annabelle's character, but Hillary wanted her daughter to be settled and happy, as she once was in Miami. The biggest reason the women had decided to move was to get away from the painful memories of Matthew, Hillary's late husband and Annabelle's father. He had died of skin cancer a few years ago, and since his death, Annabelle had gradually closed herself off. Seeing her in a good space like this was a relief to Hillary, who didn't know how to make her daughter's grieving process easier. She had only recently started to think about moving on herself. "You need to check the log for the order for Mrs. Steinmetz," Hillary said. "And double-check with Gary that the flowers are coming in too." Rose shook her head, smiling. "We have it under control, Hillary. Go on. Go home, pack your bags, and get going. The shop will survive without you. And if we absolutely need you, you're just a call away." Hillary sighed and had to give in. As hard as it was for her to leave her shop behind, she had to trust it was in good hands. Rose had years of experience, and Annabelle was dedicated to the shop. At least, she usually was. This time, Hillary noticed that her daughter was very distracted, and that every time her phone beeped, she glanced at the screen and smiled. Chapter 2. Annabelle and Hillary climbed into the car. Annabelle drove inland to drop Hillary off at the equestrian farm where Janet Hines and her sister-in-law, Megan, were hosting the getaway for the quarter. Happy Trails was a horse farm that offered stabling, trail rides, and lessons. Janet had run the farm for many years. Recently, she had renovated the place, turning the large farmhouse into an Airbnb, and she welcomed new customers almost daily. Hillary respected a strong woman who could stand up for herself and run a business. It was what she did too. When they stopped at the gate, Hillary offered to walk from there. "Are you sure?" Annabelle asked. "I can drive you up to the house." "No need. I like the exercise, and there will be so many cars in the driveway I will have to walk half the way as it is." Annabelle nodded, glancing at the time again. She was obviously late for something, but she wouldn't tell Hillary what. Hillary had tried during their drive out to Happy Trails to fish the information from her daughter, but Annabelle's lips were sealed shut. Annabelle was happy to hear her mother wanted to take her bag and walk all the way to the farmhouse. She wouldn't have made her do it if she hadn't offered herself, but Annabelle was eager to hit the road. She had suffered through a 1-hour inquisition and had hidden the details of her plans very well. "Call me when you need me to come pick you up again," Annabelle said, hugging her mother. "I'm only a short 1-hour drive away." Hillary kissed her daughter's cheek. "Thanks, honey. Have a good time. You'll let me know if you need me, right?" Annabelle reassured Hillary that she would be fine and that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself for a while. Then she climbed back into the car. She reversed into the road and waved at her mom before taking off. Hillary watched the car until it turned out of sight and shook her head. Annabelle had seemed very eager to get away from her. She tried to get the information out of her daughter, but Annabelle had been tight-lipped about her plans for the weekend, and Hillary was starting to think there was a boy involved. Maybe the bartender from Antonio's had resurfaced. Annabelle had been interested in the bartender for a while, and it seemed like they were hitting it off. But when Samantha Justin, a local author nearly twice Annabelle's age, had flirted with the boy and he'd responded, Annabelle had given up her pursuit. It was getting late. The other ladies in the book club arrived hours ago, but Hillary had insisted on taking care of the shop first. She had a business to run, after all. Hillary wanted to be sure the stock was unpacked, and that Rose and Annabelle had the store under control. She knew she was being a little overbearing, but it was the first time she had gone away since they'd arrived in Rosemary Harbor, and she wanted to be sure everything was taken care of. The sun had set, and the last light of day was thick with dusk. Hillary looked toward the farmhouse, picturesque and romantic in the twilight. It was a pity Hillary couldn't have come to the farm earlier. The other women had all arrived early that afternoon and had enjoyed a day of relaxing, horseback riding, and switching off from the outside world. Annabelle had suggested that Hillary go early as well. Her reaction to her mother's insistence that she walk herself to the farmhouse was confirmation enough that Annabelle had something important to do. But what in the world could it be? Sometimes Hillary felt left out. She was a single mom, but her daughter was too old to be parented. Hillary herself was only just starting her new independent life after a happy 30-year marriage, and even though she was unattached, she wasn't ready for dating. Sometimes Hillary felt like she'd fallen through the cracks. It was in moments like these, when she couldn't quite fit in with her peers, that Hillary felt lost. Most of the time, it didn't bother her that her life was a little different from everyone else's. But sometimes, when she had too much time to think about the future and what it may hold, she wondered where her path would lead. But right now, instead of thinking about such serious things, Hillary took in the landscape. She was here to relax and enjoy herself, not reflect on the meaning of life. The farm was laid out against the slope, so that Hillary could look out over the entire property from the flagstone path. The stables and the blinds were scattered around the farmhouse, and rolling hills stretched out on all sides. It was beautiful. Hillary could understand why Janet was so proud of Happy Trails. Movement up ahead caught her eye, and she saw a man walking around in front of the farmhouse, a man she recognized. What is he doing here? Hillary wondered. Police Chief Preston Davis stepped onto the flagstone path Hillary was following. Hillary's steps faltered. He looked handsome and important as he watched her approaching, hands on his hips. She had always found Preston attractive, even though she had been very clear with him that she wasn't yet ready to date again. Matthew had passed away just a few years ago, and Hillary didn't know if she was ready to get back into the dating game. She was angry with Preston as things stood between them anyway. She had needed his help when Rose was taken into custody for a case of arson, and Preston had shrugged her off. She hadn't appreciated how rude he was, and she had rejected his thanks when he came to tell her she had been right all along. Why was Preston at the farm? The getaway was strictly for the women from their little book club. Janet often brought visitors to the farm with her new Airbnb and the parties and events she hosted in her barns, but she had assured the book club women they would be alone for the weekend. If Preston was going to be around, perhaps Hillary should phone Annabelle and ask her to turn around and fetch her again. But no, she wouldn't let a man who had been rude to her chase her off. She was a strong woman and she deserved this break. Besides, Preston had been the one in the wrong. She wasn't going to run from him. She would man up and face him because that was what a strong woman did. So, instead of turning around and running away, Hillary held her head high and continued down the flagstone path. Preston was now looking around as if searching for clues. As police chief, it was probably second nature by now, looking for clues even when no crime had been committed. Hillary slowed, hoping Preston wouldn't acknowledge her, but he looked up at her again, lifting a hand in half a wave. Hillary sighed and gave half a wave back. "Did you just arrive?" Preston asked, when Hillary was almost caught up to him. Hillary had walked toward him because anything else would have made it clear that she was trying to avoid him. "I did," she said. I didn't know you were joining us on the book getaway. A fan of Agatha Christie? What? Preston asked, looking confused. He shook his head as if changing his mind. I must implore you to leave. Hillary was immediately defensive. If Preston was upset with her about her kicking him out of something special that day, he had to deal with it. He couldn't force her to give up her getaway because he was holding a grudge. I have a right to be here. I am a worthy member of the book club and I've been personally invited, she said. Preston shook his head. That's not what this is about. Trust me, Hillary, just go home. You can attend the next one. Hillary shook her head. The more Preston tried to get rid of her, the more she was determined to stay. She wasn't about to let a man tell her what to do. Since Matthew died, Hillary had recreated herself and become independent, and she wasn't about to give in and do what she was told, no questions asked. If this is about the last investigation and that we couldn't see eye to eye, I think you should be the one to leave. I don't recall you being a part of the book club anyway. Preston sighed, not even trying to hide it, and Hillary was even more offended that he was becoming exasperated. This has nothing to do with our disagreement, although I don't think I was wrong when I came to you to acknowledge how you had handled things. I went there to make peace. You were the one to reject it. And I'm rejecting it again, Hillary said tightly. Preston was being unreasonable, and Hillary couldn't stand unreasonable people. It bothered her that they weren't friends for the moment, but she wasn't going to give in and accept his behavior. They were both adults, and she had every right to be upset about the way she had been treated, and how Preston had disregarded the importance of the evidence she had brought to clear Rose's name. Hillary, this has nothing to do with you, Preston said. I am trying to look out for you. The way you looked out for Rose when you told me she was probably guilty without having all the evidence. I was doing my job. You must understand how hard it is for me sometimes. It's not just about misunderstanding someone's order or undercharging them. In my career, when I mess up, people die. Hillary knew what Preston was trying to say, but she was angry, and she didn't want to let it go. My career might not be so important to you, Preston, but your mistake was to wrongly accuse Rose. And you know her. You've known her for years. Did you really think she could have done it? Did you think she had what it takes to burn someone to death? Preston didn't answer. He shook his head and sighed again. This has nothing to do with Rose or my job or our argument. This is about Janet Hines. Hillary frowned. Janet? Why? Preston hesitated. She was found dead in the stables a few hours ago. Hillary's body ran cold. That's not possible, she said. I spoke to her just this morning. Preston nodded. Her sister-in-law found her in the barn. How did she die? Hillary was starting to tremble, the knowledge setting in, her adrenaline pumping through her system. That's the thing. I don't know. She has a terrible gash on the back of her head, which no doubt caused her death. The medical examiner is still on the way. He's coming from the city. When something goes wrong out here, it always takes time for the big boys to head out. Once the ME takes a look at the body, we'll know more. Hillary shivered as Preston spoke about the body. Referring to Janet that way made it seem so real, and yet so unreal. She understood now why Preston was insisting she go back home. Hillary was starting to consider it now. Hillary had been looking forward to a relaxing weekend ever since she'd accepted the invitation. She had been sure Rose was wrong about the drama between the women, and she had been looking forward to getting away and building new friendships. She shouldn't have ignored Rose's warning. In fact, from now on, she would take Rose's advice every time. Preston and Hillary walked while Preston filled Hillary in on the events of the day, and by the time they finished their conversation, they had reached the farmhouse. I wish you would change your mind about staying, Preston said one last time. You only arrived after the incident took place. You still have a chance to turn around and walk away. Before Hillary could answer, the door flung open and Megan Hines strode out. She looked stricken with grief, and when she looked at Hillary, her face crumpled. "Oh, Megan, I heard," Hillary said and walked to her friend. Megan's blonde hair was a mess, as if she had spent the whole afternoon pushing her hands into it, and her makeup was smudged after crying so much. Hillary's heart went out to the woman. After she had lost Matthew, it had been horrible, but they had expected his death. Matthew had suffered from skin cancer for 5 years. Having your sister-in-law die so unexpectedly had to hurt so much more. It all seems so unreal. I can't believe this is happening. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to deal with this? Megan was crying, her thoughts falling out of her mouth like a stream of consciousness, and Hillary shook her head, not sure what to say. What could she say to ease the pain? No words would do the trick. Megan flung herself into Hillary's arms, clinging to her as if Hillary had what it took to appease her grief. Hillary looked helplessly at Preston, who pulled up his shoulders in a shrug. Preston had the advantage in that he knew how to distance himself from a case like this. As police chief, he had done it for years. Hillary, on the other hand, wasn't only a sympathetic person, but in this case, she could empathize. Hillary looked over Megan's shoulder into the house. The other book club ladies were all in the living room, and the atmosphere was grim. Of course, it was more than understandable. Hillary found herself struggling to wrap her mind around the news that Janet had died. It seemed so surreal, and seeing all the grieving women drove the point home. It also made Hillary realize she couldn't just turn around and walk away. Not now that she had seen the pain and the suffering that ruled at Happy Trails. The decision had been made for her. Hillary was going to stay. Chapter 3. The floodgates opened with Hillary's arrival. The moment she stepped into the house, followed by Preston, the women jumped up to hug her. It was as if her arrival reminded them of the sorrow and pushed them over the edge. They cried and wailed and grieved, and Hillary had her hands full trying to console them all. They didn't even notice Preston, who stood quietly in a corner, watching. Finally, Hillary managed to calm her friends down. She was shown to her room, where she set her bag down and took a moment to recover. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. This was nothing like the relaxing weekend she'd had in mind. Still, Hillary felt an obligation to be here with the grieving women. She hadn't known Janet as long as the rest of them had, and even though she was shocked and sad at the news that Janet was gone, she knew it was hitting her friends a lot harder. Hillary felt like leaving would be refusing to acknowledge the women's pain. With so many women around, Preston seemed grossly outnumbered. It shouldn't have mattered because he was the law officer on the case, but Preston seemed uncomfortable with the tears. Hillary thought he looked like he needed a friend. Despite their differences, Hillary's heart went out to the man. Once Hillary had unpacked her bag and hung up the few clothes she had brought for the trip, she walked to the kitchen and rummaged through the pantry. She found a bottle of wine and held it up, studying the label. It was a relatively cheap wine, but it was exactly what she needed to deal with such unexpected news upon her arrival. Hillary found a corkscrew in one of the drawers in the kitchen and opened the bottle of wine. When she pulled the cork out, it made a loud pop, and all the voices in the kitchen and living room fell silent. Hillary slowly lowered the bottle of wine, hoping no one had noticed, but Rachel Marks, one of the ladies who stood next to her, held out her wine glass to be refilled. Apparently, Hillary wasn't the only one who thought about drinking at a time like this. Hillary obliged and filled Rachel's glass halfway. The woman's lips were stained red by the wine she had already consumed, and Hillary didn't want to give her too much more. "Are there any Oreos?" Kelsey Jones said, stepping back from the pantry she had been rummaging through. "I was sure Janet said she bought Oreos." As soon as she said Janet's name, Kelsey pressed her fingers to her lips as if it had been forbidden. "I haven't seen any," Rachel said tightly. "Well, you wouldn't," Kelsey snapped. "You're always thinking about healthy food." It was common knowledge that Rachel always watched what she ate. She was very public about eating healthy and taking care of her body. Some of the women called Rachel a health nut behind her back. Hillary walked into the living room with her own wine glass and the bottle of wine, filling the glasses that were held out toward her. The women all needed help to relax, and the wine seemed to be getting the conversation going. Night had fallen outside the farmhouse, and with the lights on and everyone together in the room, it seemed cozy despite the horror that had befallen Happy Trails. The fields today were beautiful, Bethany Marks, Rachel's sister, said. Everyone had gone on a trail ride, and Hillary heard that the scenery was breathtaking. She listened to descriptions of the green fields and the babbling brook with envy. The ride was great, but I can hardly feel my legs, Megan said. Don't you ride often? Sarah Stevens asked. I thought you would be out here with the horses all the time. I have a life too, you know, Megan said. Just because my sister-in-law was horse crazy, it doesn't mean that I spend all my time on horseback. I was just saying, Sarah said defensively. No one mentioned Janet. It wasn't easy to avoid the topic of her death, as everything at Happy Trails involved her, and the women were discussing her livelihood, but somehow they managed to talk about things without touching on the topic. Hillary was crawling out of her skin with curiosity. She still hadn't found out what had happened, how Janet had died. She didn't know who had found her. Preston hadn't told her much aside from the fact that she had died, and the women were all trying to keep it together by not talking about it. It made sense that they tried to avoid the topic, but Hillary could barely contain herself and had to bite her tongue not to break the unspoken rule and ask about Janet's death. Preston had been scarce since Hillary poured the wine. She was about to search for him to find out more information when he walked into the living room. He glanced at Hillary before walking to Rachel and asking her to follow him. The remaining women were quiet until Rachel had disappeared, then carried on talking like nothing had happened. How do you think the horses are coping with the events being hosted in their barn? Bethany asked. They're doing fine, Megan said. Healthy as ever. The renovation must have upset them though, Bethany said. With so many people around the place, it had to have upset the animals. Hillary joined in on the conversation. She made small talk along with them, hoping someone would drop a hint of what had happened. Oh, what would you know about the animals? Kelsey said to Bethany. You should ask Sarah. All the women looked at Sarah, who froze. Why me? She asked. You boarded a horse here for a while, didn't you? Kelsey asked. How did the renovations affect the animals? Sarah pursed her lips and shook her head. I don't want to talk about it, she said and stood up, walking to the kitchen and removing herself from the conversation. Hillary frowned. Sarah's reaction was very uptight. What's that all about? Hillary asked Megan, who was seated closest to her. Oh, Sarah boarded a horse here for a while, a horse for her daughter. But the horse passed away last week. My sister-in-law blamed Sarah for the death, even though the horse died in Janet's barn. It's a touchy topic. Hillary raised her eyebrows. It sounded like a touchy topic. She knew Sarah was a horse owner, but she didn't know the horse had died. It seemed like the story, whatever it was getting more and more layered. Hillary wanted desperately to find out what was going on, but she didn't want to be rude and ask directly when the women were all so obviously trying to make small talk. When Sarah came back, she tapped Hillary on the shoulder. Can I sit here? She asked. You seem like the only one who won't ask me invasive questions right now. Hillary nodded and shifted a little in her seat, so she faced toward Sarah, who sat down looking hurt. I'm sorry about your horse, Hillary offered. I know it can be as hard to lose an animal as it is to lose a human. Sarah shrugged. It is what it is, she said. What a strange way to respond, Hillary thought, as Sarah continued. I'm more worried about Megan. Things are already tragic with her grandmother-in-law's death. Oh, did Mrs. Hines pass away? Hillary asked, shocked. She had only met the old woman once, but she had seemed tough as nails, as though she would live forever. Last weekend, unfortunately. Of course, her inheritance is a big question, but now with Janet gone. Sarah snapped her mouth shut. What did you want to say? Hillary asked, but Sarah shook her head. It's not my business, she said. It was a very noble thing to say in a place where so much gossip took place. Hillary hoped Sarah would say more and thought, the one time she wished for gossip, she couldn't get it. How ironic. I think Kelsey should be worried, Sarah said, changing the topic. Worried about what? She wanted the farm. Did you know that? She's standing on the verge of retirement, and she told me Janet was behind on mortgage payments. I don't know what's going to happen now, but last I spoke to Kelsey, Janet somehow suddenly had enough money to pay down the mortgage so she didn't have to give up the farm. Kelsey is a new grandma, and she's always wanted the farm. You can imagine how sour she is. It wasn't the gossip Hillary had hoped for, as Sarah and Megan told her bits and pieces of information. Combined with Preston's questioning method as he came in and called women to be questioned one by one, Hillary was starting to think Janet's death had been murder. And if it had happened that afternoon, it had to have been done by someone on the farm. Hillary's blood ran cold when she thought about it, that she likely could be in the room with a killer right now. The book they had read for the weekend came to Hillary's mind, and she gave a little gasp. The plot was eerily similar to what had happened here. Hillary, Preston called from the door. It's your turn. Hillary was as surprised as the rest of the women. She had arrived well after Janet's death, so Preston knew full well she couldn't be guilty. The other women protested too, saying as much. Can I have a word with you? Preston insisted, and Hillary nodded, standing up to walk to him. She had no idea what it was about, but she was sure she would find out soon enough. What's going on? Hillary asked when Preston led her into the office where he had been questioning the women. Preston looked exasperated. None of them are telling me anything. I can't find out what's happened if no one will talk. So far, they've all said they refuse to talk without a lawyer. All of them? Hillary asked. Preston nodded. All of them. I know they didn't all do it. Hillary shook her head. That's very curious. What did you want to talk to me for? Preston sighed. I was hoping you would help me with this investigation. Hillary narrowed her eyes. Seriously? I recall you asking very specifically that I stay out of police business, she said. Every time Hillary had gotten involved before, Preston had told her to stay away. I have your right, Preston said. But I noticed how they were all talking to you when I came to fetch the next woman for questioning. If they open up to you, you might be able to help me find out the facts. Hillary thought about it. Would she be able to help at all? This wasn't the same as any of the other cases she had gotten involved in. She knew the victim and the suspects very well. They were all friends. Let me tell you what I do know, Preston said. The ME was here a little earlier. Janet died from blunt force trauma to the head. It was a horrible gash in her skull that killed her. He said since she was found in the horse stall near the trough, he's pretty sure it was that trough that did it. But for her head to come down on a trough hard enough to cause death means someone might have done it, Hillary finished for Preston. He nodded. Exactly. It has to be one of the women here. They were the only people on the entire farm when the murder took place. Hillary shivered at the word murder. What about the staff? Hillary asked. Preston shook his head. They were all let go after the trail ride this morning. I managed to find out that much. Who found Janet? Hillary asked. Megan. Megan was Janet's sister-in-law. It made sense now why Megan had been so hysterical when Hillary arrived. To not only have lost someone you loved, but also to have found the body. Hillary sighed and walked toward the window, looking out over the stables. If she decided to help Preston, she would be looking at her friends as suspects and pointing out one of them as a murderer. Could she do it? Could she play her new friends like this? She had worked so hard to make friends in town, and if this blew up in her face, she could lose them all. Was it a risk Hillary was willing to take? Hillary recalled Rose's warning that there was always drama with this bunch of women. She hadn't been wrong, although Hillary was sure Rose had never thought murder would ever be included in the drama. She also thought about poor Janet, who had been found dead in a horse stall, a gash to the head, and her plans for the future cancelled. She'd had no choice in the matter. How would she have felt if Hillary turned her back on the murder? How would Hillary have felt if the tables were turned? Not only was the injustice of Janet's death staggering, but Hillary was downright curious about what happened. If she worked with Preston on this case, she would find out what had really happened, and her need for amateur sleuthing would be satisfied. Besides, Preston was approaching her directly, and she would be nuts to turn down his offer to work on a case with his approval. Plus, his reaching out to her was an olive branch of sorts. Though Hillary was still upset about the way he had treated her, even the police chief was only human, and everyone makes mistakes. As did the person who committed the crime. Hillary needed to know what happened. She wanted to be friends with Preston again. So of course she said yes. Chapter 4. When Hillary returned from her conversation with Preston in the office, all the women had moved to the living room. Quietly, everyone watched her as she walked to her seat. No doubt, they were all curious about why Preston wanted to speak to Hillary about the murder if she hadn't been present when it took place. But no one asked Hillary directly, and Hillary didn't volunteer any information. Instead, she asked Melisandre if she had missed anything. Since we aren't allowed to leave yet, the ladies are considering carrying on with the book discussion. It was the point of this getaway after all, Melisandre said with a heavy Hispanic accent. I think it's a great idea to talk about the book, Hillary answered. It would take the ladies' minds off Janet and the terrible fate that had befallen her, and distraction was never a bad thing. Some of the other women agreed, but they took their time getting around to the book. They were still in gossip mode, catching up with each other after not having seen some of them for a full month. Hillary sat back, listening to the conversations that sprouted up around her. As much as she disliked gossip for gossip's sake, she might glean some helpful information. Preston didn't call any more women for the moment. Hillary noticed when he left the house, going through the kitchen. It seemed she was the only one who saw him leave. After Preston spoke with Hillary, he had a little more faith that he would get to the bottom of what had happened to Janet. He understood why Hillary had initially been reluctant to help him. They hadn't been on good terms lately, especially not after he had been so rude to her during the arson case. But it had been a difficult time for Preston. As Rosemary Harbor's police chief, Preston felt a lot of pressure whenever something serious happened. And lately, serious things were happening all the time. Hillary was a good friend, and the woman had an uncanny ability to ferret out clues and figure out what had happened. He would never admit it out loud, but she put his deductive reasoning to shame. With Hillary on the case with him, Preston was sure they would find out exactly what had happened. Preston headed to the stables to look for more clues. If he was going to find out how Janet died, he needed to look beyond the flimsy statements of the women he had tried to speak to. They were all rattled, traumatized by the news, and none of them had wanted to tell him anything. When Preston noticed how easily everyone spoke to Hillary, he had gotten the idea to rope her into the investigation. He'd noticed from very early on that Hillary had something about her that made people open up to her. Preston had experienced it himself. As the women became talked out in the living room, they turned their attention to the novel they had read especially for the getaway. Hillary was relieved the tension was being turned into something productive. Rosemary Harbor was notorious for its gossip and interfering neighbors, and Hillary was frustrated with people who couldn't keep their noses out of others' business. She felt a pang of guilt that she was doing the same in a sense by offering to help Preston with the investigation. But this was about murder, she told herself. This was about Janet's life and death. Hillary tried to ignore that one of the reasons she had accepted Preston's offer was because she could not contain her own curiosity. Discussing the book seemed like the only safe thing to do, but as the women started pulling apart the mystery novel they had read, they became increasingly uncomfortable. The book was about a group of people who had become suspects in a murder case because they were all stuck in a house together. "I don't like this," Megan said as they all looked at each other in shocked realization. "Is this some kind of joke?" "It can't be," Rachel said. "How would someone be able to pull something like this off anyway?" "We're all rattled by Janet's death, that's all," Sarah said. The women shifted in their seats. The tension in the room was palpable. "What bothers me is not the group of people who have become suspects," Bethany said. "I am more worried that the characters in the book are picked off one by the murderer." The women all gasped and yelped when Bethany pointed it out. The conversation became heated, with some women becoming angry and others visibly scared. "Ladies, calm down," Hillary said. "It's just a book. It's a terrible thing that happened here today, but I doubt the events in the book will take place. There is no need to panic." "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Hillary," Sarah snapped. "You may not have been here for the worst part of today, but you're here now. If everybody is going to be picked off, you're part of the party." Hillary shook her head. The conversation was becoming ridiculous. The women were working each other up, getting more and more upset about a fictional story because it looked a little bit like the reality they were stuck in. Hillary had to admit, though, that the coincidence was creepy. As the conversation carried on, Hillary noticed how the women were starting to look at each other, sizing each other up, and considering if it was possible that the murderer was among them and planning to strike again. They were starting to judge others based on their own fears and thinking they saw something sinister in each of the others that they'd never noticed before. The murder itself was forgotten, and every woman was starting to see the murderer in the others. It was unbelievable how fast people, even good friends, could jump to conclusions and start to mistrust each other. Hillary looked around at the group of women who were now all pitted against each other, and she thought back to Spot's warning before she had left something special. "Watch your back." At first, she had thought the bird was just being his goofy self, but now Hillary was starting to think maybe Spot had been right. Hillary was indeed part of the party now, and the women were starting to talk crazy. Hillary believed that the murderer was indeed among them, and even though she didn't believe that a fictional book had become reality, a seed of doubt had been placed by Bethany, who had been the first to point it out. "I think this is total nonsense," Sarah exclaimed. "Look at us. We're acting like fools, talking about taking each other out when we should be standing together in this time of need." Hillary glanced at Megan, who hadn't been saying anything at all. The poor woman had been through so much that day, finding her sister-in-law's body. Having to deal with the shock and not knowing who the killer was, but knowing that it had to be someone among the women, had to be hard. Hillary could fully understand why she would be so quiet, especially as the women were pulling things out of proportion all around her. Hillary's heart went out to the woman. Losing someone to death was never easy, especially not if the death had been violent. The conversation went back to the book after the women begrudgingly agreed they might be exaggerating a bit. Hillary was relieved. The story might have been similar to their situation, but it was straightforward and simple when it was just the story. "Let's talk about motive," Bethany said. "That's such a typical book club topic," Rachel complained. "And are we not a book club?" Bethany retorted. Rachel rolled her eyes. The tension was still thick in the air. "I want to talk about what the victim might have gone through," Sarah said. "There's always more to the story." "There can't be more to the story if it's fiction and it's all the author wrote," Kelsey said. The women started arguing again. "Why are you so quiet, Melisandre?" Bethany asked when she noticed the Latina woman wasn't offering her opinion. "Maybe she has nothing to offer," Sarah snapped. "Are you always going to speak for her?" Rachel said. "Or is it part of her job as your lackey to stay silent for you?" There was a moment of shocked silence. "Ladies, please," Hillary finally said. They were acting very mean toward each other, and Hillary didn't think any of them deserved a reaction like that, especially not Melisandre. The Latina woman had been the talk of the book club when she wasn't present for the longest time. Hillary knew Rachel had called Melisandre Sarah's lackey, because she did quite often seem to do Sarah's bidding. Hillary wasn't sure about the dynamic between the two women or why Melisandre did everything Sarah asked, but she knew Melisandre hadn't had it easy in Rosemary Harbor, and Sarah had helped her out a few times. That was a good enough reason, in Hillary's opinion, for Melisandre's loyalty to Sarah. The other women were all taking out their anger and frustration on poor Melisandre. It wasn't right, but Melisandre herself didn't appear to be bothered by it. She sat quietly without expression, taking the onslaught. It was hard to tell what she was thinking. "I don't understand why our friendship has to be questioned," Sarah said. "What's this about? Jealousy that Melisandre and I are close?" "You know well enough what this is about," Megan said, speaking up for the first time since the book discussion had started. Sarah narrowed her eyes at Megan, but Hillary didn't miss that Sarah had paled slightly. "I don't think you know what you're talking about," Sarah said tightly. Rachel entered the conversation, locking a steady gaze on Sarah. "It's about Dancer. You killed him, didn't you?" The whole room fell silent for a moment. Dancer was the horse Sarah had bought for her daughter. The horse had died mysteriously the previous week, and Sarah's daughter had been heartbroken about it. To accuse Sarah of killing the horse was reaching a new low. "I would never do such a thing," Sarah said softly. Her face was serious, her eyes shimmering, and Hillary wondered if the woman, always so perfectly put together, was going to cry. "How else would you explain his death?" Rachel asked. "The horse was fine, wasn't it, Megan?" Megan looked up, startled. "Why are you pulling me into this? What does it have to do with me?" "You started it," Rachel pointed out. "Besides, you know the horses around here." Megan shook her head. "I'm so sick of everyone assuming I know everything about the horses and the farm because Janet is my sister-in-law." How would I know what's going on here? I have a life of my own." "I heard that the horse was perfectly fine and suddenly it was dead," Bethany piped up. "It seems highly unlikely that a horse would just die like that, doesn't it?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm not even going to defend myself in this situation because it's ridiculous. Why would I kill my own daughter's horse? And how would I do it? The horse died of natural causes. I have the vet's report." Hillary couldn't control the conversation. No matter how hard she tried to pull the women back to being civilized, they unraveled again and again. The tragedy had riled them up enough that they were starting to take it out on each other, and with someone in the room still being guilty of murder, Preston wouldn't let anyone leave. No matter what, the women were going to be stuck with each other until the murderer was found and the other women were cleared. It didn't help matters that they were fighting about everything. "Your insurance payout's going to be a hell of a lot of cash, isn't it?" Bethany said. Sarah frowned. "Are you and your sister going to team up on me all weekend? Because I'm starting to get tired of your Thelma and Louise routine." "Thelma and Louise weren't sisters," Bethany snapped. "Whatever," Sarah said. "I don't have to justify myself. The horse was insured in case of death, which unfortunately happened. Am I supposed to refuse the money I'm due to make you less suspicious?" Hillary sighed. There was so much going on between the women, she understood now what Rose had been trying to tell her. She was starting to wonder if deciding to stay had been the best idea. She was here to help Preston with his case, but with the women at each other's throats the whole time, Hillary felt like she was playing referee rather than detective. "I'm getting sick of this," Bethany said when the group broke out into an argument with Rachel and Sarah in the middle of it. "This was supposed to be a nice getaway, but now we're stuck here like sitting ducks, and I feel cooped up. I want to see what Janet did with the place when she renovated. Who's with me?" The other women agreed. They stood a group again, as if their argument had never happened. There should still be appetizers around, Megan said. I helped place cheese platters and wine glasses in all the entertainment rooms. I can do with a bit more wine, Bethany said. And a break from all this nonsense. I looked forward to coming, but I regret it now. Shut up, Bethany, Kelsey snapped. Do you think any of us expected this? It's horrible for all of us. Don't single yourself out. Bethany pulled a face, but she didn't respond. They started bickering amongst each other again, and Hillary stood to the side, watching. Thankfully, she was removed from it all. Hillary often felt left out because she had only come to Rosemary Harbor a year and a half ago, and she hadn't quite learned how to fit into a community that was so close. She was at a disadvantage because she was an outsider. Now that the murder had happened before she had arrived, Hillary felt even more removed from everyone around her, but for once she didn't complain about it. She was glad to be away from the drama, to not be involved in the arguments or be suspected of anything sinister, like the death of a horse or the murder of their hostess. It had been a terrible thing that had happened at the Happy Trails farm, and she had very conveniently sidestepped the whole mess. While the women bickered and fought and slung around accusations, Hillary watched them, trying to decide who could have had a motive to kill Janet. Sarah had asked about motive in the book they were reading. Melisandre had seemed very quiet, and Bethany and Rachel were sticking up for each other like they might have had something to hide. It was hard to tell since the women were all upset about the murder, and worked up into a frenzy by Preston's questioning, and by the idea that they were being forced to stay until Preston could get to the bottom of it. It made their behavior that much harder to read. The women filtered out of the living room and deeper into the farmhouse. They commented on the renovations, squealing when they found more wine and cheese. Hillary could hear their conversations travel through the hallways, even though the house was quite big. Rachel's voice was the loudest. She had had the most wine to drink. It was diet safe, she had pointed out. It didn't matter how much of it she drank, it wouldn't affect her waistline. Hillary heard Rachel explain the idea to someone again, even though everyone had heard her story about her diet and what she was allowed 10 times. When Hillary turned, she realized Melisandre always stayed behind. After the women had climbed into her about being Sarah's lackey, she didn't blame the woman. Melisandre clearly felt left out, and that was something Hillary could relate to all too well. I don't think they meant what they said, Hillary said to Melisandre. Everyone is upset. Melisandre nodded. It's hard to deal with something so traumatic. Hillary nodded. She would have been very upset if everyone had ganged up on her, the way they had with Melisandre, but she didn't seem very upset at all. Hillary noted that Melisandre also didn't seem very rattled by Janet's death. She wondered if Melisandre had something to hide, or if she was involved somehow, and held her tongue to keep from saying something she shouldn't. While they were alone, Hillary figured it would be a good time to get the woman to talk about her side of the story. Either she would say something that would implicate her and give Hillary a clue, or she would shed light on the day that Hillary had missed, and maybe even tell her something that would point her in the right direction. Either way, it would help Hillary. Would you like to come outside for a walk with me? Hillary asked. It will be nice to have a glass of wine under the stars, to get out of the house and get a little bit of air. Melisandre looked suspicious. They're saying that the killer might pick more of us off, like the book. I don't think that's true, but how can I be sure? Hillary realized Melisandre might be nervous to be alone with her. She didn't blame the woman, after everything that had happened. But you did come later than the others, and you don't seem so mean. I like that about you, Melisandre added. Hillary was glad Melisandre had jumped to that conclusion. The women walked to the kitchen together to pour themselves another glass of wine before they walked out through the sliding doors in the living room to the porch. The air was crisp and the night was clear, showcasing a million stars. Hillary took a deep breath, glad to be away from the group of gossiping, hateful women and out here where she could think straight. Melisandre took a deep breath too, and let it out with a sigh. Chapter 5. Earlier, Hillary had poured each woman a glass of Pinot, and standing together on the porch, side by side, looking out over the ranch, had somehow acted as an icebreaker. It was always easier to open up when eye contact was broken. It was somehow less intimidating, Hillary found. She hoped the same would work now for Melisandre, who looked like she wanted to talk about something that bothered her. Melisandre was a gentle soul, and the other women had essentially steamrolled her. Even Sarah, who had stood up for Melisandre during the last verbal attack, didn't always act as protective as she had come across. Sarah also tended to add a snide comment here and there, Hillary noticed. Hillary had been the only one not to say something mean to Melisandre. She had nothing mean to say, first of all, but she had also learned that if she wanted someone to confide in her, she needed to present herself as trustworthy. Another pang of guilt shot through her chest as she considered trust and what it meant. She wasn't being very trustworthy at the moment, after all, as she was playing her friends to find a killer. But it's about safety and justice, she kept telling herself. It had nothing to do with backstabbing, simply because she had a point to prove. Hillary and Melisandre stood in silence for a while. Hillary would let the other woman fill the silence if she so pleased. If she didn't, that was fine too. Hillary had noticed Melisandre was quiet in general, and even though she didn't agree that Melisandre was Sarah's lackey, it had been a very harsh term, she had noticed Melisandre seemed very attached to Sarah's coattails. There could have been many reasons for that, though. None of which seemed fair to make snide remarks about. "The women inside are scared," Melisandre said, finally breaking the silence. "Sometimes, when people are scared, they say and do things they don't mean." "That's a very mature outlook on the situation," Hillary said. Melisandre pulled her shoulders up in a shrug. "It's better to forgive people for their flaws than to berate them. Not everyone understands that." Hillary was surprised at the command in Melisandre's voice, and the wisdom with which she spoke. She seemed to have forgiven the women for their rude behavior, and for how they had attacked her. It took a strong woman to be so calm about such mistreatment. Maybe Hillary had sized Melisandre up all wrong. Since she had joined the book club, Hillary had always thought Melisandre to be shy and unsure of herself, and she'd assumed this was the reason for her silence. Now, Hillary wondered if she hadn't gotten the wrong idea. Perhaps Melisandre's silence was because she understood people better than she let on, and she didn't see why she should get involved in petty business and pointless gossiping. "They were quite harsh inside, nevertheless," Hillary said, nudging the topic. Melisandre nodded. "Yes, pain is often the preferred weapon." Hillary wondered if Melisandre was trying to be poetic, or if it was merely how she spoke. "They're not all wrong," she added. Hillary frowned. "What do you mean?" Melisandre glanced at Hillary. "I can trust you? I know you don't talk the way the others do. You don't gossip and spread rumors. But you won't tell everyone?" Hillary shook her head. She wouldn't tell everyone. She would only tell Preston if it was something he needed to know. She was nervous that Melisandre would come out with a confession about Janet's murder that would throw the whole thing open. Finding out what had really happened would be a good thing, but Hillary wasn't sure she was ready to hear who had done it. "I was involved with the dead horse," Melisandre said, going in a completely different direction. "What?" Hillary asked. She had been caught completely off guard. "Dancer, the horse Sarah bought. I was involved in its death." Hillary tried to pull herself away from the death she had hoped to hear about, and focus on another that was far less consequential. "How were you involved?" Hillary asked, encouraging Melisandre to talk. "I was the one that brought the pharmaceuticals needed to kill it." How had Melisandre gotten her hands on pharmaceuticals? As if Melisandre knew what Hillary was thinking, she continued, "I am a pharmacist. It's not that much different for an animal. The horse already had a heart disease, so finding medication to stop the heart was easy." Hillary couldn't believe what she was hearing. Melisandre spoke about assisting Sarah to kill the horse as if it had been normal, like washing the dishes or taking out the trash. It had a heart disease? Hillary asked, focusing on the facts. Melisandre nodded. It was going to die, but the insurance wouldn't pay unless the horse died of natural causes unrelated to the disease. Sarah couldn't have the animal euthanized if she wanted the insurance money, and there was a lot of it. Sarah didn't want everyone to know the horse had been a bad buy either. Hillary shook her head, trying to make sense of this tangent they were on. There had been mention of the horse, and there were those who suspected Sarah had killed the horse. Hillary wondered why. "I don't understand what this has to do with anything," Hillary said. "I mean, it's tragic, and I understand why you would want to keep it under wraps." Hillary also thought it couldn't be legal, but she didn't say that out loud. She didn't want to come across as accusing when Melisandre was confiding in her. "You see, with the horse dead, it solved a lot of problems for Sarah, but—" She didn't get to finish her sentence. Sarah walked out onto the porch, no doubt looking for Melisandre, and heard the last of her sentence. "You little witch," she cried. "Is this how you repay me for everything I've done for you?" "Sarah," Melisandre said, and for the first time that day, she looked nervous, shocked. "I can't believe you're throwing me under the bus for this. You're an accomplice, you know." "Sarah," Hillary tried to interrupt. "This isn't what it sounds like." But Sarah wasn't even paying attention to Hillary. Her eyes spewed fire as she glared at Melisandre. "I was just telling Hillary," Melisandre started, but Sarah interrupted her. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? We were in this together, and you're going to screw me like this?" Hillary tried to get between the two women, to get them to stop fighting, but Sarah wouldn't hear any of it, and where Melisandre hadn't bothered to defend herself before, she was feisty now. The two women faced off, their voices getting louder and louder while Hillary's attempts were being drowned out by the noise. Before long, the others would come outside to see what the ruckus was about, and Hillary knew that would only make matters 10 times worse. She wished the women would stop shouting at each other. They were right up in each other's faces, Sarah going on about loyalty and allegiance, and how she didn't deserve to be treated that way. Hillary found it ironic that Sarah was going on and on about being treated wrongly, when she herself had failed to intervene when everyone had teamed up against Melisandre. But they had gone beyond the point where they were willing to listen to Hillary's reasoning, and Hillary doubted that Sarah would be open to hearing that she was a hypocrite. It wasn't exactly the kind of comment that would calm things down. "I don't know why you're so upset that I told Hillary," Melisandre said, fighting to keep calm. "Janet wasn't even that upset about us ending it for the animal." Hillary ceased trying to stop the women from fighting and listened to what they were saying. So Janet had known that Sarah and Melisandre killed the horse? "We were putting it out of its misery, so telling Hillary isn't wrong," Melisandre continued. "It makes me look like I was only after the money," Sarah said. "Weren't you?" Melisandre asked. "Wasn't it for the sake of the insurance that we took care of the animal? The only reason Janet was upset was because it might make the farm look bad, and she couldn't cope with bad publicity." "What was I supposed to do?" Sarah asked. "It was supposed to be a natural-looking death, unrelated to its heart disease. I couldn't very well take the horse away and kill it somewhere else." Hillary was trying to piece together what they were saying. It sounded like the horse had been ill and Sarah had made an effort to put it down, albeit illegally with regards to the drugs Melisandre had sourced. But Sarah was very upset that Melisandre had said something to Hillary at all, and that made Hillary suspicious. Janet had known that Sarah had killed the horse and had been upset that it happened in her barn. After everything Janet had done to the farm to bring in more business, it made sense. But if Janet and Sarah had a beef, did it give Sarah a motive to kill Janet? Hillary tried to imagine Sarah killing Janet in a fit of rage, but it didn't make sense. If anything, Janet should have been more upset with Sarah than the other way around. Which was what had happened. Janet had been worried that it would look bad and sink her business, as far as Hillary understood. Sarah had no reason to kill Janet because of it. The animal deserved a quick death, Sarah was saying when Melisandre said maybe they should have just let nature take its course. You were on board with it when I first came to you. Yes, because I agreed that the animal had been suffering. But if I had known you would be like this with me, I would have said no. I would have refused to help you. We were a team in the crime, but we aren't a team now, and I don't like when people blow hot and cold. Sarah groaned and turned away from Melisandre, running her hands over her face. She was trying to calm herself, to take a breather. Hillary tried to process the information she was hearing. Things were going in a different direction than she had expected, and even though it could possibly have something to do with Janet's death, Hillary somehow doubted it. When Sarah turned back to the conversation, she had managed to regain her composure. Her voice was normal when she spoke again. I hope you don't think I enjoyed any part of what happened, she said to Melisandre. It was as if the two women had forgotten about Hillary's presence and were having a private conversation. I hated killing that horse. He was a real sweetheart. But he was in such a bad state, and it was only getting worse. You know that. Melisandre nodded. I didn't like doing it either. I agreed to help because I could see he was sick. Now that the two women had stopped fighting, it seemed they were in agreement about what had happened and how they had felt about it. They both seemed to be sorry that they had taken matters into their own hands, and that nature had forced them to do something neither of them had enjoyed. Word of Dancer's condition couldn't come out, Sarah said, and she looked at Hillary for the first time. The insurance wouldn't cover the death if the horse was already sick when we bought it, and the vet that checked Dancer before we bought him failed to tell us he was sick. We had to do it. We had to make it happen and look like a death non-related to the heart disease for the insurance to pay out. It wasn't about being sly, it was about doing what we needed to do. Hillary nodded. I understand, she said. And I know this isn't an easy situation. With Janet's death taking place so soon after the horse's death, it had to feel uncomfortable. It was a string of unfortunate events. Emotions were running high, and everyone questioned whether the others could be trusted. It was understandable that they were all fighting and reading the worst into a situation that wouldn't have been interpreted the same way under normal circumstances. If it's any consolation, Hillary said, I don't see why anyone around here should know the truth about Dancer. This is your business with Janet. Sarah looked relieved. Melisandre was back to her expressionless mask, but when Hillary looked at her, she mouthed, Thank you, without Sarah being able to see it, and Hillary knew the woman felt a lot more than she liked to show. Her lack of expression didn't mean a lack of emotion. From what Hillary could tell, it also meant that Sarah and Melisandre were innocent in Janet's death. Hillary didn't have proof, but she had a feeling that neither of the two women was to blame for the murder. Why don't you talk to Preston about what happened? Hillary suggested. If he understands your point of view, he might realize you're innocent in the crime against Janet. Sarah shook her head, furiously. We can't do that, she said. The drugs Melisandre got her hands on weren't exactly legal, and despite what they may say about our friendship, I'm not going to put her through that when she helped me. I've broken so many rules, Melisandre said, but with the same expressionless look on her face. If Hillary had been inclined to disbelieve Melisandre or speculate that she was somehow involved, she would have taken her expression as proof of some kind. But Hillary liked Melisandre, and even though she was quirky, difficult to relate to, and rather unpredictable, Hillary felt in her gut that the women were innocent. And her gut had never been wrong. Hillary could understand their not wanting to talk to the police chief. How could Preston overlook one crime and not another? It would be unfair to expect that from him. Besides, Sarah added, it's insurance fraud on my part, which is even worse. I'm not proud of what we did. Knowing I took my daughter's horse from her will forever weigh on my conscience, and I don't think that any of it was right. But I can't come out with it. You understand, don't you, Hillary? Sarah asked, and Hillary was surprised that Sarah had felt the need to confirm. I do understand, Hillary said. She was flattered that the women had chosen to confide in her, and she wouldn't break their trust by running to Preston with the information. She knew she was playing her friends by helping him investigate the murder, but nothing Sarah and Melisandre had told her had anything to do with it, she believed, so Hillary would keep their secret until one of them spilled it or it came out another way. Hillary understood friendship and loyalty, and there had been times, during the cases Hillary had involved herself with, that she had broken the law too. Although, the level of crime was something else altogether. Hillary's crimes had been petty crimes like trespassing on private property, or sending a gift basket to the wrong place on purpose and claiming it was from someone else. Sarah and Melisandre continued to argue about outing each other's crimes, and Hillary decided it was time for her to take her leave. Only when she was away from the women did Hillary think clearly about what she had heard. She had remained calm around Sarah and Melisandre when they had told her, in surprising confidence, what they had done, but the more Hillary thought about it, the more she was shaken by the level of the crimes they had committed. And even though Sarah had said they weren't proud of themselves for doing it, they were still well aware of what they had done, and they seemed okay with it. Hillary stood in the darkness, trying to get her thoughts together. Her relaxing getaway weekend had turned out to be anything but relaxing, and she had to take a moment to breathe through everything. The women had all been at each other constantly, and even though she wasn't in the middle of their arguments, Hillary felt drained. Preston walked across the lawn toward the farmhouse, passing close by Hillary without noticing her. She didn't call out to him. She wanted to take another moment to herself. When the front door opened and Preston walked in, Hillary could hear the voices of the women inside. After what she had heard from Sarah and Melisandre, besides the murder, there were a lot of secrets going around. Hillary hoped for their sake that they would be able to keep their secrets, but judging by how the women had been tearing each other apart, Hillary doubted they would be able to keep their secrets for much longer. They were already speculating about Sarah being involved with the horse's death, and it wouldn't take long before they connected the dots. Hillary was relieved to be on the outside. It took a lot of effort to hear everyone out and try to find clues for Preston's sake, but it would have been so much worse if she had been in the thick of it. For once, Hillary was happy that she wasn't a core part of the group. Chapter 6. Finally, Hillary decided to go back to the living room and join the other women. She had told Preston she would help him find clues about the murder, and Hillary wanted to remain involved with the one crime alone. By the time she returned to the house, the women had disappeared, and she had to track them down. The farmhouse was different from when Hillary had been there months before. Some of the rooms were beautifully renovated, and others were neglected, dusty, and unwelcoming. Hillary moved through the house and shivered. In the darkness, with some of the rooms dimly lit, the thought of Janet was strong, almost like a presence Hillary struggled to ignore. She didn't believe in ghosts, but wandering through the farmhouse the first night after Janet's death was ominous at best. Hillary strained her ears and listened for the sounds of the women's voices as she moved through the house, trying to track them down. The house was shaped like a horseshoe, how apt, and it was hard to tell where the voices were coming from. Twice, Hillary had to double back and look where she had already been, because she thought she heard the women move. It was creepy that she couldn't figure out where they were, that the voices hung in the air like phantoms. "Stop being so melodramatic," Hillary told herself. The day had gotten to her in ways she hadn't expected. She mourned Janet's death even though she dealt with pain in her own way, and she was drained after everyone had either tried to draw her into their fights or leaned on her for support in this difficult time. Because Hillary wasn't involved, and because she refused to be mean, like some of the other women, a lot of people tended to turn to Hillary for support and consolation, and it was emotionally draining to be there for everyone. Including Preston, who wasn't involved outside of his business, but it felt to Hillary that even he needed her. Hillary continued to follow the voices, and this time they became louder and louder, telling Hillary she was on the right track. Finally, she found them, and it was no wonder Hillary hadn't been able to track them down before. The room they were in was a new one that had been added to the farmhouse, instead of an existing room that had been renovated. The room had large windows that Hillary imagined had a stunning view of the farm during the day. The windows were all covered by rich curtains now. The room was set up as an entertainment room of sorts, with sunken lights in the ceiling and sofas and large pillows scattered across the room. Music played from speakers in the corner. A buffet-type table had been set up at the side of the room with platters of cheese and crackers and more bottles of wine. The women were huddled around the table, pouring themselves something to drink and nibbling on the treats Janet had no doubt set out as a welcome party. The women were talking harshly amongst each other, and Hillary understood why it had been hard to track them down. It hadn't been a normal conversation, with the lilt of voices rising and falling. Once again, Hillary wasn't a part of the group discussion, and once again she wondered if it was such a bad thing. She was curious what the topic of discussion could be about this time, but she was reluctant to get involved when the women seemed so aggressive. Hillary poured herself a glass of wine and sipped the red wine carefully. She had already had 2 glasses, and she wasn't in the mood to get drunk like some of the other women were. Rachel, for instance, seemed well lubricated and not shy to speak her mind because of it. Usually, she was controlled and thought before she spoke, but right now she looked like she was starting to unravel. Hillary watched as Rachel slyly reached for a platter of chocolate Hillary hadn't spotted before. The platter was neatly arranged with pieces of chocolate, some of which Hillary sourced herself through something special. Rachel reached for one chocolate after the other, eating them, not realizing that Hillary was watching her. So much for her strict dietary regime, Hillary thought. First the wine and then the chocolates. Either Rachel wasn't nearly as strict as she liked to portray, or the woman was eating her emotions. When Hillary had moved to Rosemary Harbor, the town had been eager to invite her on social media and add her to the numerous groups that kept the gossip circulating even after those speaking it had gone to bed. Through Facebook and Twitter, Hillary had gotten to know the people who lived around her without having met them directly, and she felt like she had been asked to be a part of something bigger. Since then, she had realized that she still didn't quite belong, but her recent admission to the inner circle, in a manner of speaking, kept her informed of many of the town's favorite subjects. For instance, Rachel was forever bragging about her strict exercise and dietary regime, posting articles, blogs, and passive-aggressively bashing everyone else who didn't take care of their bodies the way she did. Which was why it was such a surprise to see Rachel indulging in wine all day and eating the chocolate now. "Don't you want to take another piece?" Bethany said snidely when Rachel hadn't reached for the chocolate for a while. Apparently, Hillary wasn't the only one watching. The conversation halted, and everyone looked at Rachel. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, seemed at a loss for words, then closed her mouth again. After all, there was nothing she could say in her defense. Instead of justifying her actions, Rachel's eyes blazed, her cheeks flushed, and she turned away, refusing to make eye contact with any of the women. She had violated her own rules, and they were pouncing on her for it. This was what happened when hypocrisy was invited to the party, Hillary thought. She hated seeing people uncomfortable, but she couldn't defend Rachel, as Bethany was well within her rights to comment on it. Rachel glanced at Hillary, who stood by, helpless to save the woman from the grave she had dug for herself. "Perhaps we should move to the kitchen and make supper," Hillary said. She hoped to break up the conversation and take the spotlight away from Rachel, but the women weren't in the mood to play nice. It seemed to Hillary that since the murder of Janet Hines, every woman who had been invited had decided to show their true colors, and none of it was pretty. It is strange how in adversity, people shift to who they really are, Hillary thought. And it is scary how many people put on a mask of kindness when in truth they are wretched inside. What do you think of the renovations, Hillary? Megan asked, after Hillary noted that none of the women intended to go to the kitchen. I think they're wonderful, Hillary said carefully. She was sure Megan had a reason for asking. If it weren't for Rachel, they wouldn't have happened at all, Megan said, and Rachel sighed, exasperated. Megan had been passive for most of the night, seemingly in shock after she had found her sister-in-law dead in the barn. It was strange that she was piping up now, ready to stir trouble. Hillary knew she was being baited, but curiosity got the better of her. What do you mean? Oh, Janet couldn't dream of affording these renovations, Megan said. Megan was obviously dragging it out to create suspense, and it was working. Hillary knew she was being malicious somehow, if the women's tense silence was any indication. Hillary didn't prompt Megan again. Instead, she waited for Megan to carry on. Rachel was the one that fronted all the cash for it, Megan finished. There were a few gasps in the group, which suggested that Hillary wasn't the only one who hadn't known. Hillary was surprised. She hadn't thought about where the cash could have come from, of course, but it changed things. If Rachel had forked out cash for Janet, it meant Janet would have been in her debt in some way or another. I wonder how Rachel will get that money back now, Megan continued. If you haven't been paid back, that is. And I doubt you have. Hillary looked at Rachel, who had breathed in sharply. Her eyes were a little out of focus, and she had gone very pale. She didn't look like she felt well. After so much wine and chocolate, Hillary could only imagine how sick Rachel must be feeling. Mixed junk food after a diet, trauma after the murder, and gossip that was intended to start a fight couldn't have been a worse combination. Rachel took a deep breath and let it out slowly, trying to keep her emotions and perhaps the contents of her stomach under control. I think the place looks great, Hillary said. Surely it didn't matter where the funding had come from. She knew little about Janet's financial business, and that was how it was supposed to be. For everyone. Megan was Janet's sister-in-law, so maybe she knew more about Happy Trails than anyone else, but Hillary still thought it wasn't Megan's place to talk about Janet's financial difficulties. The woman had been murdered only a few hours earlier. Hillary knew the quip was not said to disrespect Janet as much as to put Rachel on the spot, but unfortunately it did both. Rachel even jumped in and helped, Megan said. She pointed at an antique settee. Do you see how beautifully that's done? Brocade, the real deal. Everyone looked at the settee, and Hillary had to admit it looked great. Brocade was not cheap, and it took money to reupholster it that way. If that's what Rachel chose to do with her money, I commend her, Hillary said, trying to smooth things over. But wasn't it alone, Rachel? Megan asked. The woman was being aggressive, and Hillary felt for Rachel, who looked sicker by the second. You've got it wrong, Megan, as usual. Besides, my business with Janet was private, Rachel said with a strained voice, and Hillary was glad she was able to stand up for herself, as inebriated as she was. But it's something that we should talk about, seeing that I'm left to have to handle whatever debt there might be. Hillary wondered if Megan had had a bit to drink as well. She didn't remember Megan being so aggressive, and it was making everyone uncomfortable. If there's something you'd like to discuss in private, I'll be more than happy to. Rachel cut her own sentence short by pressing the back of her fingers to her lips. She wasn't doing very well, and it was plain as day now that she was feeling sick. I'd rather not discuss business in front of everyone else, Rachel added, her voice more strained than before, as if her throat was being squeezed shut. Oh, we're all friends here, Megan said. Most of us, anyway. After all, the killer is still around, isn't she? Rachel gasped, and Hillary had to admit it sounded an awful lot like Megan was pointing fingers. Why would I kill her if I want her to pay me back? Rachel asked. She pressed her hand to her throat. It was a wonder she was still on her feet. Megan blinked at Rachel as if she hadn't considered it. But what Rachel had said made sense. And what motive did you have for helping her fix the place up? Megan asked, sounding angry. What was Megan so upset about? Because it's my... Rachel stopped, her eyes widening and her throat convulsing as she gagged. She cupped her mouth and turned, running from the room. Bethany followed, running after her sister, who was undoubtedly going to throw up. Hillary looked around the circle. Everyone was looking in horror at the door where Rachel had disappeared. Either they were as shocked at Megan's attitude as Hillary was, or they were shocked and concerned about Rachel's health. Probably both. "Oh, the drama," Megan said, and walked in the other direction, leaving through the sliding door that led to the garden. When she was gone, the tension bled out of the atmosphere, and the women looked a little more relaxed. It was fascinating how one person could alter the climate of an entire room. Hillary took note of the women's reactions. "Well, I have no idea what all that was about," Sarah said. Melisandre nodded. The other women agreed. "Megan was a little over the top there, to say the least," Kelsey confirmed. "I knew Rachel and Janet had some business together, but is nothing sacred? The poor woman died today. Pulling her intentions apart like that was poor taste." Hillary nodded. She agreed fully with Kelsey. A short while after Rachel had run from the room, Bethany returned. "She's had too much to drink, my poor sister," Bethany said. "I'm going to stay with her for a while to make sure she's all right." She turned to leave the room again. Hillary wondered why Bethany hadn't said anything in her sister's defense when Megan attacked Rachel. But Rachel had always been the stronger of the two, and Hillary didn't know them well enough to understand their dynamic. Megan returned a few minutes later, and the women tensed up again, everyone wondering whom Megan would attack next. But Megan held her tongue. "Why don't we carry on with a tour of the house?" Hillary said. "I'd like to see the other rooms. A distraction would also do them good," she thought. "I don't think I'm going to join you," Kelsey said. "I need something in my stomach after the wine, something more sufficient than crackers and cheese." "I could do with some fresh air," Sarah said, and turned toward the door without waiting for a reply. Melisandre followed her, as Hillary had expected she would. "I would rather go to my room," Megan said. Her voice wilted again, as if her aggression had bled away and she had reverted to the pained sister-in-law she had been all day. One by one the women begged off, finding something better to do than what Hillary suggested. She didn't blame them. It had been an emotionally taxing day after everything that had happened, and it looked like the women were getting sick of each other. Hillary was starting to feel the pressure as well, despite the fact that she wasn't directly involved. It was a blessing that the women had decided to split up. It meant Hillary didn't have to babysit to keep them from each other's throats. She watched as the women disappeared one by one. Hillary felt she wanted to go somewhere where she could be alone as well. Either she would go back to her room or take a walk outside, although the idea that someone on the property had killed Janet made her uncomfortable walking in the dark alone. Hillary couldn't imagine any of the women she had come to know doing something so heinous, but it had happened, and until Hillary knew what the motive was, at least she would watch her back as if she had been a part of the group from the start. It was safer that way. Hillary wondered how Preston was doing with his investigation while she had been caught up in the drama the women were weaving. She considered finding him and catching up with the information he might have found. Talking to Preston might not be alone time, but it would be less strenuous than being with the women so far, so it would be a break nevertheless. Hillary headed toward the glass doors that led outside, deciding it was faster to go across the patio to the living room to find Preston rather than working her way through the large farmhouse. "Where are you going?" Bethany asked Hillary. Hillary frowned, turning to Bethany. "Sorry, I don't mean to pry. It came out wrong. I only wanted to know if you're on your way to something urgent or if we could have a chance to talk," Bethany said. It had come across wrong, but now that Bethany reworded it, Hillary realized how guarded she already was. She nodded slowly. She could spare a moment to talk to Bethany. If she was lucky, Bethany would confide something that would help her with the investigation, as with Sarah and Melisandre. Although what she had found out from those two had done little to help other than leading Hillary to believe they were innocent. Still, every little bit of information helped. Of course we can talk, Hillary said. It's been quite a rough day. Bethany sighed. Oh, you have no idea. She sat down on the antique settee that Megan had pointed out earlier, and Hillary sat down next to her. The settee was beautiful, reminding Hillary of French Versailles, although she had no idea what era the settee had come from. She knew very little about furniture. You ought to know that it wasn't Rachel's money that paid for the renovation, Bethany said, and she sounded oddly defensive. What do you mean? Hillary asked. It was mine. In a way. Hillary shook her head. But Megan was quite aggressive toward Rachel, specifically. Does she not know? Bethany shook her head. No one knew, not even Janet. You need to know Janet didn't treat my sister very well, Hillary. I had to do something. Hillary frowned. What did you do? Surely you understand how far a person would be willing to take something for family? Janet wasn't paying Rachel back. I'm paying down the debt on Rachel's credit card with my own money so Rachel doesn't lose her business. It's not right. Hillary shook her head, trying to understand what Bethany was saying. Wait, now you're saying Rachel paid for the renovations with her credit card? She asked. It's complicated, so let me start from the beginning, Bethany said. Rachel recently started an interior design business, and Janet was her first client. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Don't we all work with friends and family until we're on our feet? Well, Janet kept defaulting on the payments, so it's up to me to keep the business afloat. Rachel isn't the strongest businesswoman. She doesn't demand money back as intensely as she should. Hillary didn't know what to make of what Bethany was saying. She was hearing a lot of covering. Bethany was desperately trying to make it sound like she was the one who had taken Janet out, but it didn't add up. Bethany seemed too intent on selling it. So intent, in fact, that Hillary was willing to bet Bethany was taking the fall for someone else. Someone who was retching in the bathroom. Chapter 7. Under normal circumstances, the women wouldn't have minded being at the farm all weekend. It had been the plan, after all. Leaving hadn't been a part of the plan until it was time to leave. Janet had ensured there was enough food, and the idea was to escape reality. Now that tragedy had struck and a killer was on the loose, the circumstances were decidedly different. Also, now that no one was allowed to leave, the same setup that no one would have minded before was a problem now. Everyone was aware that they weren't able to leave, and it upped the tension levels. They were forced to stay, so now they wanted to leave. It was a classic situation of wanting what you couldn't have. Hillary decided the sisters, Bethany and Rachel, needed space. She needed a break as well. Every time she tried to get away to be alone, it seemed someone else wanted to speak to her. Preston had been right to ask her to get involved. The women did confide in Hillary a lot more than she expected. She had found out quite a bit more than she would have paid attention to, had she only tried to be there as a shoulder to cry on. Hillary followed the path she had initially intended to take, passing across the patio between the living room and the break room they had been in to make her way to the kitchen. Thankfully, she didn't run into anyone else on the way, and Hillary was relieved. She needed a break from the women who were either aggressive or hysterical, depending on how well they were dealing with the murder and the changes in personalities around them. When Hillary reached the kitchen, Preston was standing at the counter making himself a BLT sandwich. Hillary watched as he carefully cut the sandwich, and his attention to detail amused her. Hillary had spent a fair amount of time with Preston while they investigated cases or when she ran into him, but they had only gone on a few short dates, and that hadn't been enough to give her complete insight into who he was. When she saw him like this, she felt she was privy to a side of Preston he wouldn't show anyone. Preston looked up, sensing Hillary's presence, and he grinned at her as if he had been caught in the act. If I'm going to be stuck here, I might as well help myself to the food as if I was a guest. Hillary nodded. I agree. Can't have you going hungry. She didn't mention what she was sure they were both thinking, that without Janet there was one less person to feed. A sudden wave of sadness washed over her. She had had her hands full with the women acting out, and she hadn't had a chance to reflect on the fact that a friend had died, that someone's life had been cut short. The tragedy was staggering if she thought about it for too long. Would you like to split it with me? Preston asked, pulling Hillary from the spiral of her thoughts. Preston held out the plate with his sandwich, and Hillary realized what he was asking. She smiled. I'd like that, she said. Preston split the sandwich, giving Hillary her half on her own plate, and they sat on the bar stools around the island counter. Hillary bit into the sandwich. This is so good, she said after she chewed and swallowed. She hadn't had much to eat, and after the glass or two of wine, the food was more than welcome. How are things going with the women? Preston asked. Hillary pulled up her shoulders. A lot worse than you can imagine. Everyone is grieving in their own way, but I don't think their ways fit so well with each other. They're clashing quite a lot and mean streaks are showing. Preston nodded slowly, chewing. I did find out a few things, Hillary said, and I'm jumping to conclusions, but I'll explain why. Hillary relayed everything she had learned to Preston, everything except what she'd learned about the horse's death, and he listened patiently as she explained. When she finished, he had eaten his half of the BLT. Hillary bit into what remained of hers. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the house settle down around them as more women retreated to their rooms or kept themselves busy. I think I might be onto something with the Marks sisters, Hillary finally said. I don't know what's going on, but it seems that Bethany is trying to take the fall for her sister. It makes me wonder exactly how involved Rachel was in this whole scenario. Has anything specific been said? Preston asked, and Hillary knew what he was asking. He needed a solid confession, something that he could count as proof. Hillary shook her head. Nothing that could implicate them for sure. I'll need a little bit of time, but considering everything I've heard, that's where I'll start looking. Preston nodded. We have a bit of time. I'll keep them here as long as I need to. Until we find the killer, no one can leave. Even if it takes weeks. Hillary didn't like the thought of being cooped up in the farmhouse for that long. It was already getting to be a bit much, and she had only been thrown together with the other women for the evening. It felt much longer than that, with the emotional roller coaster being so draining. I think that's more than enough talk about crime for now, Hillary said. Let's focus on happier things. Such as dessert, Hillary said, grinning. I overheard there were Oreos to be had. I'm with you, Preston said and stood up. They moved to the pantry and started their search for the infamous Oreos. Hillary covered the bottom shelves before Preston took over and scanned the top shelves with his added height. When they had worked through the pantry and come up with nothing, Hillary sighed, disappointed. I was sure there were Oreos here, someone had mentioned it. Maybe they've already been found. Oreos never last long. Dang, Hillary said. I think that's my break for the night, Preston said once they had given up the search. He glanced at his wristwatch. I wanted to talk to Megan before everyone turns in for the night. She's been avoiding me. I can't imagine how hard this must be for her, Hillary said. Preston nodded and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Hillary behind with her thoughts. Megan and Janet had been close, and losing family was always horrible. Hillary's heart went out to the woman, to every single one of them, but to Megan most of all. Hillary? Rachel asked, coming in the kitchen. She looked around, checking to see if the adjacent living room was empty as well, before she sat down at the island counter in the seat Preston had used. How are you feeling? Hillary asked. Rachel blushed. I feel like a fool, she said. I had far too much to drink. It's just so difficult, you know? I know it's hard, Hillary sympathized. I want to talk to you about Bethany and what she might have said to you earlier, Rachel said. Hillary nodded, willing to listen. It was always good to hear both sides of a story. It made it easier to piece together the puzzle and find out what had really happened. Hillary was nervous about what could follow. What if Rachel confessed to her? But she had to keep her head. I don't know what my sister told you, but I overheard you talking to the police chief about the money that Janet owed me. Hillary hadn't thought that the women would be listening in on their conversation. She had made a point of keeping her voice low. I'd like to clear a few things up. Bethany wasn't involved at all. Not with the renovations or the murder or anything. She was going to stop giving me money to fund the credit card account, even though Janet wouldn't pay up. I didn't blame her at all because Bethany was starting to run out of money herself. My sister has always been there for me, and I will always be indebted to her. It must have been worrying, Hillary prompted. It is worrying, Rachel agreed. I don't want my business to close before it started. I love redecorating rooms, and having a business where I can do that makes me happy. Doing this house just reminded me how much I love it, and how I think this is the career for me. Rachel looked down at her hands, knotting her fingers together, elbows on the counter. Hillary waited for her to speak. Sometimes a little bit of silence was all that was needed for those with a confession to fill it. I was going to confront Janet about it this afternoon, Rachel said. I knew I had to talk to her about it, that I couldn't keep expecting Bethany to fight my battles for me. I told Bethany I would handle it. But I was too nervous, and I ended up here in the kitchen. She glanced up at Hillary and she looked guilty. No doubt you've noticed, I can't control what I put in my mouth when I panic. I was in the pantry eating Oreos, instead of talking to Janet. I was such a coward. I had a bit of wine, and when I stopped caring about my looks, it only takes a few sips to do that, I stuffed my face like a pig. Rachel looked emotional. That was why she couldn't find the Oreos, Hillary thought, then realized the Oreos were the least of anyone's concerns. When I was done with the cookies, Megan ran inside screaming, telling us Janet was dead. Rachel started to cry, tears running down her cheeks. I didn't do it. Even if I had been able to confront her, I wouldn't have killed her. I needed to get my money back, and with Janet dead, that just won't happen. She looked up at Hillary. You believe me, don't you? Hillary didn't have any proof that what Rachel said was true, but again she followed her gut, and something told her Rachel was telling the truth. She nodded. I do, she said. Rachel cried harder. I feel so guilty, she said. What about? If I had gone to talk to her instead of hiding in the pantry like a coward, maybe this would never have happened. You can't blame yourself for this, Hillary said, and she stood, walking around the counter to Rachel. She hugged her, and while Rachel cried in her arms, Hillary understood why the woman had been eating junk and drinking so much wine all day. Even though she hadn't committed the murder, she felt guilty as though she had. Knowing that Rachel hadn't done it was a relief because it was one more person scratched off Hillary's list. The list was getting smaller, but there was still a handful of women who could be guilty, and Hillary had no idea how they were going to find out who had done it. Chapter 8. Rachel mopped up her tears, sniveled for a while, and finally offered Hillary a wan smile. Thank you for listening, she said. It feels great just getting that off my chest. Hillary nodded. You're welcome. Rachel slid off the stool at the counter. I'm going to bed. I think I can do with a bit of rest. She pressed her palm against her forehead. Good night, Hillary said, and was awarded with another smile before Rachel disappeared. When she was gone, Hillary took a deep breath. That had been more emotion than she expected. She had thought Rachel was the killer, but now that she saw how guilty Rachel felt even after she told Hillary where she had been, Hillary doubted Rachel could have committed the murder. Besides, what Rachel said made perfect sense. If she had killed Janet, she would have cut herself off from getting back the money, and there was no logic in that at all. Hillary was still in the mood for something sweet. The chocolates set out with the wine didn't appeal to her for some reason, and anyway, there wasn't much of it left. She walked to the pantry again, remembering a stash of other treats she had come across when she was searching for the non-existent Oreos. She found the treats and decided on a bag of gourmet chocolate chip cookies. Hillary didn't know how they would be any different from standard chocolate chip cookies, but she was about to find out. Hillary walked back to her seat and pulled open the bag, taking a cookie and biting off a piece. She studied the cookie while she chewed. They weren't nearly as good as they looked, she had to admit. Still, they were sugary, they were starchy, and Hillary was in desperate need of some comfort food. She wasn't alone for long. Kelsey walked into the kitchen and put the kettle on the burner after she filled it. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said. Hillary shook her head, even though she would have preferred to be alone. Kelsey folded her arms across her chest and leaned her hips against the counter while she waited for the kettle to boil. She glanced at Hillary from time to time, and Hillary wondered if the woman had something on her mind, but she wasn't going to ask. Kelsey was older, close to retiring age. If she had something to say, Hillary had no doubt that the woman, wise in the ways of the world and past the age where she cared what people thought about her opinion and actions, would come right out and say it. The kettle boiled, whistling loudly, and Kelsey took it off the burner. "Tea?" she asked. Hillary nodded. "I'd love some, thank you." A bit of tea would be perfect to wash down the dry cookies she was eating. Kelsey poured 2 cups of green tea and put a cup down in front of Hillary before she sat down. "Are you willing to share those?" she asked, gesturing toward the cookies. Hillary nodded and offered Kelsey the bag. "They're not nearly as good as they look," she warned. Kelsey took one and dipped it in her tea for a second before she bit into it. She looked at the cookie while chewing, as Hillary had done. "I agree." Before a conversation could start, Megan walked into the kitchen. She looked wary. Hillary wondered what state of mind she was in, and if she was going to get aggressive or be her normal self. "Did the kettle just boil?" Megan asked. Kelsey nodded, and Megan walked to the stove to make herself a cup of tea as well. "How are you holding up?" Hillary asked. No matter how poorly she had behaved, Megan had still lost someone dear to her, and she had been the one to find the body. That trauma was unimaginable. "I'm managing," Megan said, but she looked and sounded tired. "I must say it's a little hard having everyone here. I would have preferred for them to leave, so I can mourn my sister-in-law in peace." "I can imagine it's hard," Hillary said. She knew every woman would have preferred to leave the farm and let Megan mourn, to each process her own grief and trauma alone. But with the killer on the loose, no one could leave until the mystery was solved. Hillary thought again about how the day had become so similar to the book they had been reading. At least no one else had suffered the same fate so far. The speculation that something might go wrong had upset everyone, but as time had passed and everyone was still breathing, the panic subsided. Hillary prayed that it would stay that way. Megan sat down with her cup of tea, and Kelsey offered her the bag. The 3 of them drank their tea and crunched their way through the cookies in silence for a while. Hillary was caught up in her thoughts. She had been sure she had figured out who did it, but now that she was convinced Rachel was innocent, the question was unanswered again. "Where is Chief Davis?" Kelsey asked, breaking the silence. "He must have his hands full investigating this, with so many women to question." "He's with Bethany and Rachel right now," Megan said. "I saw him take them to the office when I came to the kitchen." "Oh. Did you hear anything?" Kelsey asked. She was clearly interested. Megan shook her head and looked around the kitchen. She sighed. "It's a pity this will all have to go now," she said. "My sister worked so hard to make this a reality and keep going." "It is a pity," Kelsey said bitterly, and Hillary noticed her tone. She frowned. Why was Kelsey bitter about it? Or did Hillary read her wrong? Whatever Kelsey's reason for reacting that way, she didn't take it further, and Hillary was glad Megan had steered the conversation away from Preston's investigation and that he was questioning the Marks sisters. Hillary didn't feel like more gossip and a fallout. There had been too much of that during the evening. She didn't want to discuss the possibilities of whether either of the sisters had committed the murder or were capable of something so heinous. Bethany and Rachel were close, and they were both eager to stand up for each other. It was clear that they would take the fall for each other, and Hillary preferred not to discuss the likelihood of there being a reason for it. Hillary had her own opinion on the matter, but she wasn't willing to share her thoughts. She was naturally curious to a fault, and she was always the go-to for conversation or advice, as had been proven throughout the day, but she wasn't a gossip, and she tried to keep information to herself rather than spreading rumors. It was a feat to stay out of the gossip circles in Rosemary Harbor, where everyone knew everyone's business. But Hillary knew that if she started to stir trouble in a group of women who were already tense, it would only blow up to become even worse than what it already was. "Preston is very dedicated to this investigation," Kelsey said. Hillary nodded. He is. He is one of the best detectives I have ever seen, for that reason." Preston might not have had the skill some detectives in Miami had, but Hillary meant what she said. As police chief, Preston was emotionally involved with every citizen in his town, and he was serious about solving crimes to keep the people of Rosemary Harbor safe. It was what made him the kindest and best of men. "Are you close to him?" Kelsey asked. The conversation had stayed away from Rachel and Bethany, but it had turned to Hillary, and she was uncomfortable with it. It was so easy to become the topic of discussion. "As close as anyone in town," Hillary said, even though she knew it wasn't true. Preston was interested in her, he had been since she'd moved to town, but she wasn't ready for this conversation. "Preston is a good friend to us all." Kelsey didn't look like she bought that response, but she didn't press it. "Rachel did a very good job of renovating this place," Kelsey said. The topic change was quite abrupt, but Hillary was relieved. "She did," Megan said. She was glaring daggers at Kelsey. "Are you going to put in an offer as soon as the dust settles on this whole murder thing?" Hillary's jaw dropped. The passive Megan was gone, and her aggressive side was showing again. Kelsey sawed her jaw, searching for words, but she didn't find any. Her cheeks flushed bright red, and she glanced at Hillary. Hillary had no idea what was going on, but it was clear that Megan had struck a nerve. The conversation had turned suddenly hostile, and Hillary tried to figure out what had changed, where the subject change was coming from. She was suddenly not so sure it was a good thing they weren't discussing Rachel and Bethany's involvement directly. This topic seemed a lot touchier than anything Hillary had been worried about. The right thing would have been to break up the conversation and get the two women apart, but Hillary's curiosity got the better of her. She wanted to know what was going on. She didn't encourage the women to keep at it, and she didn't ask questions to find out what Megan was talking about. But Hillary didn't make a point of stopping the conversation or changing the subject either. Instead, she remained silent and waited for Megan to carry on. Megan clearly had something on her mind once again, and Hillary wanted her to say it. If anything, it would be to find out another piece of the investigation puzzle, Hillary told herself, trying to justify her curiosity. "Come on, Kelsey. Don't try to hide it," Megan said when Kelsey didn't respond. "It's no secret that you were involved with the remortgage." "I know because Janet told me, but you've been talking about it too. Haven't you?" Hillary frowned. She had known Kelsey worked at the bank, and she vaguely recalled Kelsey mentioning that she was in the home loans division, but Hillary only put the two together now. Apparently, Kelsey had handled Janet's mortgage. "I don't discuss classified information with outsiders," Kelsey said. Megan rolled her eyes. "Please. Your dream of owning a horse farm was hardly a secret, and you knew Janet couldn't pay down her mortgage. I'm willing to bet you had your sights set on this place, just waiting for the moment Janet was forced to sell. Am I right?" Kelsey's lack of response suggested that Megan had hit the nail on the head. "What I want to know is how she got out of her hole," Megan said. She looked at Hillary. "Janet couldn't repay the mortgage until recently. Suddenly she had all this cash, and no one knows where it came from. Suspicious, don't you think? Hillary had to admit it did seem suspicious, but she only shrugged. Megan looked at Kelsey, who was blushing again. Megan's eyes widened. You know, don't you, she said. You know where the cash came from. And here I thought it was this big mystery. Where did she get it, Kelsey? Kelsey shook her head. I told you, I don't discuss classified information with outsiders. I could get fired for that. Megan raised her eyebrows. I'm her sister-in-law. It's in the family, after all. But you didn't help repay any of it, did you? Kelsey snapped. Was your signature on any of the paperwork? Whether you're related or not, you have no say about Janet's finances unless you were legally accountable. Megan shook her head. It's a pretty speech, but what are you hiding? Kelsey started to look panicked. I'm not hiding anything, she said, but even Hillary could see that Kelsey was indeed hiding something. Do you know what I think? Megan asked, and the tension in the room was palpable. Megan was verbally attacking Kelsey, and the older woman was visibly stressed. I think you killed Janet for the information. Hillary gasped. Megan, she cried out. It was a terrible accusation. Even if it was true. I didn't do it, Kelsey blurted out. Janet came into possession of a large diamond ring. She put it up as surety for the farm. It was worth enough. Kelsey snapped her mouth shut as if she had said too much. Megan narrowed her eyes. What? She asked in a low voice. I saw it. And I found the paperwork that proved what it's worth. It's all legal. It's here somewhere, in fact. How do you know? Megan asked. She looked suspicious, yet another emotion Hillary didn't understand. Because I saw the ring, Kelsey said. I saw it on her desk when I came to take care of the remortgage paperwork. Janet slipped it away before I could ask about it, and it was clear she didn't want it to be common knowledge, so I didn't push. But I wanted to know if it was valuable. I needed to know if she could use the ring to pay off the mortgage. And? Megan asked when Kelsey stopped talking. Kelsey took a deep breath and let it out slowly. And I snooped for the paperwork. She covered her face with her hands. I feel terrible about it. I can't believe I stooped so low. But I wanted this farm. Kelsey looked at Hillary. I didn't want to move away from Rosemary Harbor to realize my dream of owning a horse farm. My granddaughter just turned 1, and I can't bear to be away from my kids and my sweet little grandchild. Getting my hands on the farm would have fixed that for me. Hillary nodded. Kelsey had felt the need to justify her actions, and Hillary understood it. Anyway, Kelsey carried on, looking into the empty teacup in front of her. I found the paperwork for the diamond ring. It shattered my dreams. Janet wouldn't have to sell the ranch with the proof of that ring being legitimate. So that's my happy ending gone for the moment. Megan shook her head. I can't believe it. When I heard she had found money somewhere for the mortgage, I would never have guessed it was the ring. You know about the ring? Kelsey asked. Megan nodded. It's a family heirloom. It's a large diamond, the biggest anyone that laid eyes on it has ever seen. They just don't sell diamonds like that anymore. It was a ring that was meant to be passed down from one generation to the next. When I married Charlie, he was supposed to get it. That was the tradition. Hillary had met Charlie, Janet's older brother, only once. She hadn't liked him at all. The man was charming, but in a way that made Hillary feel like he was like that with everyone. He had swept Megan off her feet, but he seemed to do that with a lot of women. Hillary didn't think Charlie made the cut as a good husband. He wasn't involved with his family, and because he left Megan alone so often, she had spent a lot of time on Janet's farm. When Grandma Hines died, the ring was nowhere to be found. There was nothing in the will about it either. But Grandma Hines hadn't updated her will in years, and it's possible she forgot about it. She wasn't all there when she died. Hillary remembered Mrs. Hines to be sharp and to have her wits about her. The old woman had known exactly who she was and what she was doing. But Hillary hadn't been with her until the very end, and she hadn't known her very well in life either. It was possible that what Megan was saying was true. We thought the ring had been lost, stolen, maybe even sold. Anything could have happened to it. I have no idea where it is now. I didn't know Janet knew about it at all. She frowned, and it wasn't hard to see the bitterness and resentment that brewed inside Megan now that she realized Janet had had the ring that should have gone to her husband. Hillary considered that the ring should have been on Megan's finger, had the tradition been upheld. It was something to take note of. An expensive, rare ring, a family tradition that hadn't been upheld. It sounded like something for Megan to be bitter about. Well, if it's the same ring, it's not lost, Kelsey said. Of course, I don't know what your family ring looked like, and I hardly got a good look at it before Janet removed it from my sight. So I can't tell you what ring it was or where it came from. Megan nodded solemnly. I don't know if I want to know. Chapter 9. I think we should find it, Kelsey said. What? Megan asked, perking up a little. We should find the ring. Janet can't tell us where it is anymore. May she rest in peace. Megan nodded, looking like she really liked the idea. You're right, she said. If we find it, we can tell if it's Grandma Hines's ring. She had a crazed look in her eye that Hillary didn't like, but Megan had lost her sister-in-law, and there was hope that there was something of Janet's that she could hold on to. If anything, she wanted to help Megan find closure after what she had lost. Let's look together, Hillary suggested. We can cover more ground with the three of us, and 3 pairs of eyes are better than 1. Kelsey and Hillary both nodded. The hunt for the diamond was on, and it felt like they were doing something constructive. After an evening filled with arguing and gossiping and drinking and mourning Janet's death, it felt good to be doing something useful. The 3 women decided to start in the living room at one edge of the horseshoe-shaped house and work their way through the house room by room. The living room didn't offer anything other than small ornaments and plants that needed watering. Hillary thought she would do it when she had a chance in the morning. When they moved to the next room, Sarah wanted to know what they were doing. We're looking for a ring, Megan said. Hillary wondered if it was better to keep it a secret, although lying about it wouldn't have been much better. Don't you think if there is a killer around, someone might try to steal the ring as well? Hillary asked Megan, after she had pulled her to the side. It's another pair of eyes, Megan said. Besides, I don't think anyone is going to steal from a dead woman. Hillary was taken aback by how blasé Megan suddenly sounded about her sister-in-law's death, but she couldn't argue with Megan's logic, and she agreed. They explained the situation briefly to Sarah, who left the room to find Melisandre before the 2 women joined in the search. As they moved through each room, the other guests wanted to know what was going on. Megan was comfortable telling them all what they were doing. Hillary kept out of it after she had said her piece. The women all decided to join in, offering to help. Hillary considered that they would all be happy to do something productive, to work together when they had worked against each other since Hillary had arrived. Systematically, the women worked through the house, and it was a good feeling to know that despite what had happened, they could still stand together as friends. As they searched, Hillary thought about the events that had happened throughout the evening and the different reactions the women had offered to certain pieces of news. Everything had made sense, except Megan's reactions. She seemed to fluctuate between aggression and depression quite quickly. Hillary understood that it was a difficult situation, but something about the way Megan had reacted about the ring didn't feel right. Hillary couldn't put her finger on it. She racked her mind as they searched, but something kept nagging at her subconscious. When Rachel and Bethany joined the search, Preston found Hillary. What's going on? He asked. Hillary explained to Preston what they were doing, that they were searching for the missing Hines ring. Apparently, it's a family heirloom, quite valuable, and after Janet's death, there's no way of knowing where it is. Let me help you look, Preston said, and he worked with Hillary, going through the rooms with her. While they searched, they held back a little from the rest of the group, and Hillary relayed the conversation she had with Megan and Kelsey in the kitchen. "That's interesting," Preston said after Hillary had explained about Kelsey wanting the farm. "Do you think she could have done it? It's a motive for murder." Hillary shook her head. "I must tell you, I don't know. Something about all of this is bugging me. Everything else we found out made sense, but this just doesn't add up." "Talk to me. Maybe we can get through it," Preston said. Hillary nodded, and she had to admit it felt good to be able to talk to Preston, and for them to be on good terms again. She had missed this. She enjoyed spending time with him, and she was so interested in investigating crimes. Kelsey was saying Janet would use the ring to cover the mortgage, so it's quite a valuable ring. "An heirloom, you said?" Preston said. Hillary nodded, and suddenly she realized what had been bugging her. Megan had been sure from the start the ring was the Hines ring, even though she had no idea that it was the same ring Kelsey had seen. Kelsey had made her point that she didn't know if it was the ring Megan had been talking about. Still, Megan had insisted. If Megan didn't know where the heirloom ring had disappeared to, how did she know the ring they were searching for was one and the same? Hillary remembered now a conversation she had had with Rose quite some time ago. It had been about Mrs. Hines becoming ill and where her possessions would go. Hillary had only paid half attention, and she regretted it now. Rose always went on, and sometimes Hillary switched off to it. Rose had mentioned how Mrs. Hines had been rich beyond belief, but her riches were in the form of assets rather than pure cash. Hillary remembered thinking what a good idea it was. Rose had told Hillary in awe about the ring that had been meant for Megan once she had married Charles Hines, someone Rose didn't believe deserved any of the riches because he was, as Rose had put it, a vile man. Rose went on to say that for whatever reason, Mrs. Hines never gave the ring to Charles and Megan. Megan said the ring had been lost, and it made sense why Megan was so eager to find the ring now that Mrs. Hines had died. Hillary realized that Megan would see the ring as her due, and her frantic search for the ring was because she wanted to find what was hers. If the ring Kelsey had seen was indeed the ring Megan was supposed to inherit, the mystery of Janet's death would take a whole new turn. Hillary could imagine it now. A woman, the second-born in a family where the ring was passed from firstborn to firstborn, and Megan, who would wear a ring that was that valuable. What if Janet hated the idea? And then the ring had disappeared, and now it had apparently resurfaced in Janet's home when she technically had no right to it. If Janet had intended to use the ring to pay off her mortgage, it would be all the more insulting. When Hillary explained her theory to Preston, the police chief nodded. "That's a plausible theory, but until we have evidence, we can't assume that Megan might have done something to secure the ring." He didn't say the words he and Hillary were both thinking, that Megan might be guilty of her sister's death. They moved from room to room, the women working together in a group, and the atmosphere was cheerful and determined. Having something to do was doing all the women good. Hillary looked around to see what frame of mind Megan was in when she realized Megan was gone. Hillary walked to Preston. "Have you seen Megan?" she asked. Preston shook his head. "I can't say I've seen her with us in the past few rooms we covered, but I wasn't exactly paying attention to her." None of them had been paying attention to Megan, Hillary thought. It seemed as though Megan had slipped away. Even though Kelsey had been the one to suggest the search for the ring, Megan had been very excited about the idea. It was strange that she wasn't with the women now, searching. Hillary didn't want to make a scene asking everyone where Megan had gone. She had a feeling it was best to keep that information to herself, lest someone say something foolish and everyone start with their accusations again. It was the worst time for that to happen. Instead, Preston and Hillary again hung back a little. "I think we need to reevaluate our search," Hillary said to Preston when they were out of earshot. "I want to know where Megan is." "I agree," Preston said, and leaving the room where the other women were still frantically looking for the ring, Preston and Hillary started their search for Megan. Hillary tried to recall in which room she had last seen Megan with them, and Preston and Hillary both agreed Megan must have split off when they had passed the office. It was, after all, where Kelsey said she had seen the ring last. Preston and Hillary put their heads together and tried to think where Megan could have gone. Preston and Hillary watched as the women moved on to another room. As soon as they were able, Hillary and Preston went in the opposite direction and continued their search alone. They walked to Megan's room together after they checked the office. It was empty. Hillary hoped Megan would be in her room with a perfectly sound reason for her actions, but she doubted it. The longer they carried on, the more she started to think that Megan looked guilty. Her strange mood swings and outbursts, how she challenged others, how she openly accused others of the murder. None of it made sense, and Hillary was starting to think Megan had something big to hide, despite how distraught she tried to look all the time. Something big like Janet Hines' murder. What did she say when you questioned her? Hillary asked, realizing that after they had discussed all the women and their stories, Preston hadn't relayed what Megan had said to him. Preston shook his head. I haven't questioned her yet. I wanted to talk to her first, but she was so distraught about her sister-in-law's death, I didn't want to be tactless. So I decided to hold off for a bit, out of respect for her loss. So she hasn't said anything to you at all? Preston shook his head. Megan was very close to Janet, and after she ran to you, crying when you arrived, I felt bad for her. There were so many women to question, and so many motives that could have driven anyone to take Janet out. I was a little shocked. I thought y'all were good friends. Hillary nodded. They were friends, but friends with secrets. There had been many motives at first. As they had spoken to the women, either through Preston's investigation or through what the women had confided in Hillary, the motives had dwindled, and there seemed less and less reason for any of the women to have taken Janet out. But Megan's motive was different. Right now, it's all speculation, Preston said, speaking Hillary's mind as if he knew exactly what she was thinking. But a large family diamond that had suddenly gone missing seems like a very big motive to me. Hillary nodded. As horrible as it was to think that Janet's own sister-in-law could have been the one to kill her, it wasn't impossible. Megan had been aggressive enough, her actions volatile and unpredictable. Megan's reaction had changed abruptly when she found out the diamond had recently been seen, and it was suspicious. I hate to think that this could be the answer, Hillary said. Again, I don't want to think that anyone could have killed Janet, but the possibility that it was Megan breaks my heart. Preston nodded. As much as I love my job, investigating, finding answers to questions, this is the part one hate. I hate having to arrest people I know, to realize that they did something so terrible. Hillary understood what Preston was saying. Living in a town as small as Rosemary Harbor meant everyone knew everyone, and to see someone she knew convicted of something as serious as murder made it that much more painful for Hillary to watch. The women were on the far side of the house. Hillary and Preston could hear their chatter as they worked together, searching for the ring. Something clattered in the office nearby, and Preston and Hillary looked at each other. Without a word, they ran to the office together. Hillary was the first to enter, and she caught Megan with her hand in the bottom drawer of Janet's desk. "What are you doing?" Hillary asked. Preston came in behind Hillary and they stood together, blocking the door. "Taking what's mine," Megan said in a low voice. She slowly lifted her hand from the drawer, a dark blue leather box clutched between her fingers. Hillary and Preston didn't move, and Megan opened the box. They all gasped when they saw the ring. It was beautiful, the gold intricately carved with vines and flowers, a large diamond mounted in the middle, and there was no doubt it was the family heirloom and not just any diamond ring. Megan walked toward the door with confidence, as if she was sure she would be able to leave without having to answer to anything. Preston and Hillary stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the exit. Megan wasn't going anywhere until they got to the bottom of what happened, and Hillary had a feeling the final outcome of their investigation would be a sad one. "You can't take the ring," Hillary said. "And why not?" Hillary's mind spun, searching for a reason. She needed to stop Megan. Because it's evidence now. It's a murder case. That's right, Preston said. It's evidence. Of what? Megan asked, and she looked angry. It's not a murder weapon. It was only found now, hours after Janet's death. This will do nothing for the investigation. Preston shook his head. You don't have to understand the logistics. As an officer of the law, I demand you hand it over. It will be logged as evidence and released to you once everything has been cleared up and the court cases that may follow are resolved. Megan looked shocked. That could take years. Preston shrugged. Unfortunately, that's how the system works, Megan. I don't make the rules. Hillary was impressed that Preston had caught on to her little ploy so quickly, and she felt they were a team. They stood together. I can't believe this. Megan cried out. She still held tightly onto the diamond and glared at Hillary. There is no way you're going to mess this up for me. You're always such a little do-gooder, pretending to be there for everyone, but you're really just stabbing us all in the back, working with him, aren't you? A pang of guilt shot through Hillary's chest. Megan was right, of course. She had played her friends to be of help to Preston. But she reminded herself that she had never betrayed any of her friends. She had merely listened to what they had to say. Shooting everyone else down is not going to change the facts, Hillary said. Megan had been aggressive toward everyone, and Hillary was starting to understand why. Oh, please. What do you know about me? About anything that has been going on? You've only been here for what, a year? You don't know anything about me and my life or Janet and hers, and what I've had to endure to get this ring. This is my right, and I have worked far too hard and sacrificed too much just to let this go. Preston started to say something, but Megan carried on. It was as if she had bottled it all up for so long. Now that there was a chance to get it all out, Megan was set on speaking her mind. Janet had taken the source of my future. This ring will pay my way if I leave Charlie. He can't seem to keep it in his pants, so I need this to pay my way if I want to get out. Megan, I'm sorry, Hillary said. Her heart broke for the woman who was stuck in a marriage that made her feel so small. I don't want your pity. I don't want anything from you. I want you to leave me alone. The police can't take this away from me, not over a mistake. I won't let them. What mistake, Megan? Preston asked gently. He seemed to understand that Megan was on the verge of spilling everything. Megan's eyes widened when she realized what she had said. I mean, she said, trying to fix it, but tears suddenly rolled over her cheeks, and as if it was the last straw, Megan broke down and cried. I never meant to hurt her, she cried. I never meant for her to die. It was a mistake. I wanted the ring back, and Janet wouldn't give it to me. I shoved her, which wouldn't have been that big a deal, but then she tripped and hit her head. And I didn't help her. Instead of saving her, I let her die because I thought if that bitch is gone, it's less for me to worry about. I'm such a horrible person. Megan fell to her knees, sobbing. Hillary had a lump in her throat. Preston touched her arm, a small gesture of sympathy, before he walked to Megan. He spoke gently to her as he read her rights to her and put her in handcuffs. You are under arrest for the murder of Janet Hines, he said. You have the right to remain silent. But there was nothing else to be said. Megan had confessed to the murder of Janet Hines, and she was going to jail for a long time. Epilogue. Let me take you out, Preston said. He stood in something special, leaning against the counter. Hillary and Preston sitting in a tree, Spot squawked, and Preston turned red. Hillary laughed. It was endearing to see the man blush. When Hillary glanced at Rose, the older woman was smiling. Annabelle was at Antonio's on her lunch break, and Hillary was glad her daughter wasn't around to be upset about Preston asking Hillary out. Annabelle never approved of Hillary wanting to move on from her late husband, Matthew. Will you think about it? Preston asked. I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. Oh, it wasn't much, Hillary said. Preston shook his head. Don't be modest about it. If it wasn't for you and how you managed to get the women to open up for you, we would still be stuck on that farm trying to find the culprit. I have only you to thank for that. Preston was interested in Hillary. He had always been. But after he had seen her in action, he realized how much he cared for her and how badly he wanted to court her. She was an incredible woman, and her compassion and her deductive reasoning made her amazing at solving mysteries. Preston had to admit that it wasn't always a bad thing to have civilians involved. It was a different angle, and Hillary had such a good view of things. Preston wanted to explain to Hillary how he should have accepted help from the start, no matter where it came from. He had been so rude to her, rejecting her help and shooting down her theories, and now she had proven to him that she was a great help and a great friend. Hillary smiled and nodded, accepting the offer. Let's have lunch together, Hillary said. Preston was making up for his mistakes, apologizing for them, and it was all Hillary could ask for. Everyone made mistakes. It was how they made it right that mattered. Preston and Hillary had connected again, and Hillary realized how much she liked him and why she was so attracted to him. It was hard for her to move on after Matthew, but she had to admit that with someone like Preston, she might give it a chance one day. For now, a date was good enough. I'm taking my lunch break, Hillary said to Rose. Will you be all right alone in the shop? More than all right. I could do with a little alone time. Don't rush back. Rose winked at Hillary, who blushed. Kissing, Spot screeched when Hillary and Preston left the shop, and Hillary rolled her eyes at the crazy parrot. Preston and Hillary walked to Antonio's. Hillary steered them away from the bar area where she knew Annabelle would be, and they sat down at a table for two and looked at the menus. They made small talk, and Hillary had to admit it was good. They hadn't been at the farmhouse for more than one night. Some women had left the same night once the news had come out that Megan was the killer. Others had stayed overnight and left in the morning. Hillary had stayed to be sure everyone was okay. The women were distraught, and none of them had been able to believe that Megan would do such a thing. It felt good to be back in the real world, as Hillary liked to think of it. Her time at the farmhouse while the investigation was pending had felt surreal, like they had been caught in a bubble. But Hillary much preferred it back home with the ones she loved, the ones she cared about. I want to tell you again how grateful I am for your help, Preston started, but a ruckus in the bar area cut him off and drew everyone's attention. Oh no, Hillary said when she noticed Annabelle standing at the bar having a full-on argument with the bartender she had been sweet on for a while now. Don't you dare sweet-talk me. Annabelle cried and tears ran down her cheeks. You told me I was the only one. But you are, the bartender said, but Annabelle shook her head. I'm so sorry, Preston, Hillary said. I need to help my daughter. Of course, Preston said, and he tried his best not to look disappointed. I'll make it up to you, Hillary said, and she meant it. She stood and walked to Annabelle. She would always be there for her daughter. Family was the most important thing. But for the first time, Hillary regretted having to walk away from Preston. She would definitely make it up to him, soon. Thanks for listening to The Diamond Hunt, Book 4, from the Rosemary Harbor Cozy Mystery Series. Written by Wendy Meadows and read for you by Michelle from Google AI. For more information on Wendy's available books, visit www.wendymeadows.com.